Intro. Tonight, I invite you to settle into a quiet place, to let the noise of your day soften, and to allow your thoughts to drift gently across the wide open spaces of the American Great Plains. For the next while, I will guide you through a story whispered by wind and memory. It is a story that unfolds slowly across tall grasses and endless horizons. A story of a creature so mighty that entire ecosystems, cultures, and generations once revolved around its rhythmic migration. Tonight, we begin the calm and reflective journey through the near extinction of the Great Plains bison from the early 1800s to the end of the 19th century. As you listen, imagine the land before roads, before fences, before the restless hum of modern life. Picture the grasslands as they once were, stretching from the prairies of Canada down toward the warmth of Mexico. These plains held a pulse, and that pulse was the bison. Tens of millions once thundered across this vast region. Their presence shaped the soil beneath them, the predators around them, and the lives of the indigenous nations who relied on them for food, shelter, tools, and spiritual identity. But tonight, we move gently through a chapter of history where that seemingly endless abundance began to fade. A slow and quiet unraveling set in motion by market forces, expanding railroads, hide hunters, military policies, and profound cultural shifts. By the end of the century, the great herds, once impossible to count, had dwindled to mere hundreds. There is no hurry as we explore this story. Each part of this series will unfold at a peaceful pace, almost like following the bison along their ancient paths. We will look at the landscape they shaped, the people who lived beside them, the changes that swept through the plains, and the deep loss felt by both land and culture. By moving gently through this past, we can understand not only how the bison nearly vanished, but how they managed to survive at all. So let the day slip away. Let the imagery of open skies fill your mind with something soft and steady. When you are ready, we will walk quietly into part 1, where the world of the early 1800s still held herds so large that settlers described them as rivers of life flowing across the earth. Part 1. The Great Herds Before the Fall. Before the world changed for the Great Plains bison, before rifles sounded across the horizon and trains carved hard lines through open country, there was a time when the land moved with a steady and living rhythm. To begin this story properly, I want to guide you gently into that earlier century, into a world where the bison herd still existed in numbers so vast that early accounts struggle to describe them. In the quiet of this evening, imagine yourself drifting back across time, back to the year 1820, when the plains were still a world defined mostly by the forces of nature and by the indigenous nations who understood those forces intimately. Breathe slowly as you picture the landscape. The grass stretches out in waves, soft and unbroken. The sky is wide and pale, the kind of sky that makes the earth feel endless. The breeze carries the scent of soil that has been enriched for centuries by migrating animals. In the distance, you sense movement. Not the movement of a few scattered creatures, but a slow and continuous shift of life itself. This is the bison herd, one of countless herds that roamed through the heart of North America. In these early decades of the 19th century, there may have been more than 30 million bison across the plains. Their presence shaped everything. The soil beneath them was turned and compacted under their hooves. The grasses grew in harmony with their grazing. Predators like wolves and bears depended on them. Scavengers, insects, and birds followed in their wake. The land was not merely a place where the bison lived. The land was a partner in their existence, shaped by their migration and renewed by their constant motion. For the indigenous nations of the plains, the bison was far more than a source of food. It was a foundation for life. The Lakota, Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Crow, Kiowa, Comanche, and many others had cultural traditions rooted in the cycles of the herds. From the bison came shelter in the form of hides, tools in the form of bones, clothing, thread, glue, and so much more. The animal carried meaning beyond the physical. It represented abundance, renewal, and a connection between earth and spirit. To understand the near extinction of the bison, we must first understand the depth of this relationship. It was not simply that the bison sustained life. It was that the bison shaped identity and gave rhythm to the year. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a camp of the early 1800s. Teepees set in a wide circle, their poles pointing upward toward the sky like a forest of slender trees. Smoke drifts softly from the tops of each shelter. Children run in the grass. Elders sit together weaving stories and memory. Hunters prepare for a journey that they know well, a journey shaped not by conquest but by careful respect. When the herd appears on the horizon, the entire community adjusts its heartbeat to match the slow and patient breath of the plains. The early European explorers who encountered these scenes struggled to describe them. Some wrote that the herds took days to pass. Others reported that the plains seemed black with animals, as if the earth itself had grown a thick moving blanket of life. When they rode on horseback toward the herds, the ground trembled beneath them. When they stood among the animals, the air carried a deep and rolling sound, almost like distant thunder, but somehow calmer. A sound that rose from thousands of hooves and low rumbling calls. A sound that made the plains feel alive. At this moment in history, there was no thought that the bison could ever vanish. Their numbers felt eternal. Their migrations felt timeless. The people who lived with them believed in the cycles of plenty and the cycles of need, but not in the possibility of total loss. The idea that such a vast population could be erased in less than a century would have felt unimaginable. Yet even in the early 1800s, subtle changes were beginning to ripple at the edges of this world. The fur trade had already expanded across the northern forests. Horses, introduced generations earlier, had reshaped hunting methods and intertribal dynamics. New diseases, carried unknowingly by settlers and traders, had swept through many indigenous nations. And in the east, along the Atlantic coast, the population of the United States continued to grow, sending waves of settlers pushing steadily westward. The plains, though still largely untouched, were no longer beyond reach. At first, these changes felt distant from the bison herds. The land was so immense, and the animals so numerous, that even the presence of trappers and traders barely seemed to alter the balance. Some hunters from the indigenous nations began trading bison robes with newcomers, but these trades still occurred within the limits of natural cycles. The hides were taken seasonally, often in winter, and the numbers harvested were small compared to the size of the herds. Nothing yet hinted at the storm that would soon sweep across the plains. Still, history moves quietly at first. The earliest shifts are rarely dramatic. Instead, they begin as whispers. A new road laid somewhere in the east. A new technology arriving in a distant port. A treaty signed hundreds of miles away. In the calmness of the moment, these signs do not seem dangerous. But they accumulate. They gather force. They shape futures before anyone realizes what has begun. So part 1 closes gently here, in a moment of balance. The year is still early. The herds remain intact. The land still carries the deep pulse of millions of hooves. The cultures of the plains remain strong, connected, and rooted in traditions that have lasted for countless generations. but change is approaching slowly across the horizon. Tonight, you have stepped into the world before that change. In the next part, we will walk softly into the early pressures that began to shift this relationship and set in motion the long and painful journey toward near extinction. Part 2. The first ripples of change. As we continue our quiet journey through the near extinction of the Great Plains bison, I invite you again to slow your breathing and settle deeper into the vast stillness of the early 19th century. The herd still roam freely, and the plains still stretch out in gentle waves beneath the open sky. Yet the seeds of change have already been planted. History often shifts not through dramatic upheaval at its beginning but through small adjustments that gradually build into powerful currents. Tonight, we drift softly into those first subtle ripples that began to disturb the balance between humans, land, and the mighty bison. In the 1820s and 1830s, few would have predicted the coming collapse of the herds. The American frontier still felt distant from the heart of the plains, and the rhythms of life among the indigenous nations continued as they had for generations. The buffalo hunts, the seasonal migrations, the ceremonies honoring the animal that sustained so much of daily life, all continued in harmony with the natural world. But far to the east, in growing cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, forces of industry were quietly gathering strength. Factories were rising. Markets were expanding. And demand for animal hides and furs was increasing with every passing year. One of the earliest shifts came in the form of the bison robe trade. Traders, eager to profit from the highly valued winter robes of the bison, journeyed deeper into the plains. At first, the trade seemed harmless. Indigenous hunters harvested robes in winter, during a season when bison were traditionally hunted for thick hides that offered warmth and durability. These robes became a commodity, exchanged for metal tools, rifles, powder, and other goods that could be used in daily life. This exchange appeared balanced for a time, but it introduced something new into the relationship between the people and the herds. Instead of hunting solely for the needs of the community, some hunters began taking additional robes to trade. This did not yet threaten the bison on a continental scale, but it signaled a profound shift. The bison had become part of a larger economic system, one that operated on principles of profit rather than sustainability. Quietly, the animals were being woven into a network that extended far beyond the plains, reaching markets that would eventually demand more than nature could replenish. As trading posts spread across the region, new patterns of competition emerged among indigenous nations. Horses had already transformed the dynamics of hunting and warfare, allowing tribes to travel farther and move more quickly than they had before. The robe trade added another layer to this transformation. Access to rifles, ammunition, and metal tools could shift the balance of power between neighboring nations. As a result, some tribes intensified their hunting efforts, seeking to acquire valuable goods in exchange. And while these hunts were still conducted with knowledge and respect for the herds, the sheer scale of economic incentive began nudging the system toward imbalance. Alongside trade, another quiet force of change came from the arrival of disease. Long before many settlers reached the plains, waves of illness traveled ahead of them. Smallpox, measles, and cholera swept through indigenous communities, sometimes carried by traders or passed unwittingly from distant regions. These epidemics took a devastating toll, reducing populations, weakening social structures, and disrupting the generational knowledge that had long governed hunting practices. In the aftermath of disease outbreaks, some tribes struggled to maintain traditional patterns of migration and resource management, creating small fractures in the delicate harmony between people and bison. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, the United States continued to expand westward with growing speed. Treaties were signed, many of them deeply flawed or coercive. Lands were ceded, boundaries were drawn, and the vastness of the plains began to shrink in the imagination of those living east of the Mississippi. Though the open grassland still appeared boundless, the political landscape was becoming tighter, more controlled, and more pressured. Across the ocean, fashion trends in Europe created a rising demand for buffalo hides. For a time, the robe trade remained centered on winter hides, which were thick and warm, but new markets soon sought summer hides as well. Factories found uses for leather, tanneries expanded, and the value of bison products grew. These changes happened slowly at first. A few more traders arrived. More posts were built along rivers and trails. More hunters participated in seasonal exchanges. The system was not yet overwhelmed, but it was beginning to stretch. Picture the plains during this quiet turning point. The herds still move across the horizon, their shadows sweeping over the grass as the sun shifts. Wolves still follow their migrations. Birds still circle above. The indigenous nations continue to honor the bison through ceremony and practice. Yet underlying this beauty is the early tension of a world beginning to shift into unfamiliar patterns. The balance that had sustained these lands for centuries is no longer as firm as it once was. By the 1840s, American settlers had begun traveling the Oregon Trail in large numbers. These wagon trains followed routes that skirted parts of the plains and, in some regions, crossed directly through bison territory. Although settlers rarely hunted the bison in large numbers during these early crossings, their presence signaled another kind of change. Roads, even temporary ones, created disruptions. They altered migration routes, created lines of movement that bison learned to avoid, and introduced new human pressures that the land had not previously absorbed. Settlers also brought livestock that grazed on prairie grasses, competing with bison for food. They introduced commercial ideas about land use, fences, and private property, ideas that contrasted sharply with the communal and ecological relationships that had shaped the plains for centuries. The land, once open and free-flowing, was beginning to experience early hints of confinement. Yet even now, most people believed the herds could withstand anything. To see tens of millions of bison moving through a landscape the size of a continent created a sense of permanence. The idea of vulnerability did not cross the minds of traders, settlers, or even many hunters. But ecosystems are delicate, even when they appear strong. A world built on balance can unravel when small disruptions accumulate. So part 2 rests gently here, at this moment before true crisis. Trade has woven its threads into the life of the bison. Disease has touched the communities who long sustained them. Settlers have begun crossing the plains, bringing new pressures with them. The changes are still quiet, still subtle, but they have begun. In the next part, we will drift into the accelerating transformations brought by railroads, industrial markets, and the growing movement of American expansion. Part 3. The railroads and the widening market. As we move gently into Part 3 of our story, I invite you to drift deeper into the quiet landscape of the 19th century plains. The sun hangs low over the grasses, the evening breeze settles into a soft whisper, and the distant shapes of bison herds still move with an ancient steadiness. Yet beneath this serenity, the forces of change that began in earlier decades are gathering strength. In this next chapter, we step calmly into the world of railroads, expanding markets, and the rapidly accelerating transformation that would soon reshape the destiny of the Great Plains bison. Let your breathing slow as we imagine the early 1850s. For generations, the rhythms of the plains had been shaped by nature and by the people who lived in harmony with its cycles. The bison moved across the land like tides of life. The indigenous nations followed those migrations with care and knowledge shaped by countless seasons. But beyond the Mississippi River, the United States was changing quickly. New cities were growing, industries were rising, and the desire for expansion had become a defining element of national identity. It was in this environment that the railroad emerged as a powerful force, one that would soon touch the plains with both opportunity and destruction. At first, the railroads were far away. Their early lines connected eastern cities and industrial centers. But every year, they pushed farther west, driven by investment, ambition, and the promise of economic gain. For many Americans, the railroad symbolized progress. It offered speed that had once been unimaginable. It connected distant regions and opened new territories for settlement. But for the Great Plains and the animals that lived there, the arrival of railroads would signal a dramatic and often painful shift. The vastness of the plains had once provided a kind of protection for the bison. Even as the robe trade expanded, even as settlers and trappers crossed the region, the sheer scale of the landscape allowed the herds to continue their migrations. But railroads had the power to slice directly through these open spaces, creating narrow but insistent lines of human movement that the bison could not easily avoid. In the 1850s, early surveys laid down the paths for future routes. Engineers and laborists began marking the land, cutting trails, and laying the first stretches of track. With each mile of track placed across the plains, new pressures emerged. Construction crews required food, often hunting bison to supply meat. The movement of trains startled the herds, disrupting familiar migration routes and drawing animals toward areas where they were more visible and vulnerable to hunters. When tracks were completed, trains carried settlers, traders, and, eventually, professional hide hunters into regions that had previously been difficult to reach. More than anything else, railroads connected the bison herds to global markets. Previously, even the most ambitious traders faced logistical challenges in transporting hides. Wagons were slow. Long distances were difficult. Seasonal weather limited movement. But once the railroads reached the plains, a new and relentless efficiency took hold. Hides could be shipped quickly to tanneries in the east. Meat could be salted, packed, and transported. Bones could be collected and sold to fertilizer factories. Suddenly, every part of the bison had value in the eyes of industry, and this value rose sharply as markets expanded. If you listen closely in your imagination, you might hear the distant echo of a train whistle breaking the quiet of the plains. You might picture the enormous steam engines rumbling across the grasslands, carrying passengers who leaned out to witness the herds from their windows. Some of these travelers wrote about the overwhelming sight of bison stretching for miles. Others, influenced by the excitement of novelty, fired rifles out of train windows simply because the opportunity was there. At first, these shots rarely killed the animals. The train moved too quickly. The distance was too great. But the behavior signaled a turning point. The bison had become a spectacle, something seen not as a partner in an ancient ecosystem, but as an obstacle or amusement in a rapidly transforming world. The railroad companies themselves contributed to this shift. In an effort to attract settlers to new lands, some companies organized promotional hunts. Wealthy travelers from the east boarded trains not to reach destinations, but to experience the thrill of shooting bison from the comfort of a moving car. The animals began to fall in greater numbers, not for sustenance, not for necessity, but for entertainment and profit. These hunts, though still relatively small compared to what would come later, signaled a deep change in the way society viewed the bison. The presence of the railroad also encouraged the rise of commercial hide hunting. With transportation no longer a barrier, professional hunters moved onto the plains in larger groups. Their goal was not to honor the cycles of nature or to sustain a community. Their goal was to maximize the number of bison killed in the shortest possible amount of time. Skilled marksmen, armed with powerful rifles, could take down dozens of animals in a single day. Teams of skinners followed, stripping hides and leaving the rest of the carcass behind. The landscape began to change in ways that would have been unimaginable only a generation earlier. Even as these new pressures emerged, there were still moments on the plains when the world seemed unchanged. Herds continued to roam. The grass still whispered in the wind. Indigenous communities still followed the old rhythms. But beneath these familiar scenes, the foundation was beginning to crack. Markets were expanding. Technologies were advancing. And the mindset of westward expansion, with its focus on economic gain and territorial control, was steadily growing stronger. By the 1860s, the Civil War had reshaped the political and economic landscape of the United States. When the war ended, attention turned once again to the West, and the drive to connect the country through railroads intensified. In 1869, the Golden Spike was driven into the earth at Promontory Summit in Utah, marking the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. The Great Plains were no longer a distant frontier. They had become a corridor of national ambition. So Part 3 comes to rest here, at the moment when the balance tipped more noticeably. The early ripples of change we saw in earlier decades were now gathering into stronger currents. The railroad was reshaping the land, the markets, and the relationship between humans and the herds. The world of the bison was still alive, still moving, still breathing across the grasslands. But the forces arriving on steel rails would accelerate everything that followed. Part 4. The rise of commercial hide hunting. As we drift gently into Part 4 of our quiet exploration of the Great Plains bison, allow your mind to settle once more into the slow rhythm of this landscape. The plains stretch wide beneath an open sky, and the evening light glows softly along the horizon. The herds still move with an ancient calm, but the world around them has changed. The railroad has arrived. Markets have expanded. And now, a new and far more devastating force begins to shape the destiny of the bison. This is the era of commercial hide hunting, a period when the pursuit of profit would unravel the balance that had sustained these great herds for untold generations. Let yourself breathe slowly as we move into the middle decades of the 19th century. The quietness of this moment belies the intensity of the changes that were unfolding. Trains rolled across the plains with increasing frequency. Settlers built towns near rail lines. Trading posts multiplied. And professional hunters began organizing themselves into teams that operated with efficiency and purpose. Their focus was simple. They were there to take hides. Everything else about the bison was considered secondary or even irrelevant. Commercial hide hunting was different from anything that had come before it. Traditional hunting among indigenous nations was guided by ceremony, respect, and necessity. The robe trade, though it had introduced new economic incentives, still operated within seasonal cycles. But commercial hide hunting was driven by the demands of industrial markets. Factories in the eastern United States, and even across the Atlantic, had discovered new uses for bison hides. They could be processed into leather belts for machinery, soft robes for winter fashion, durable goods for manufacturing, and materials for countless other products. The value of hides rose sharply. And with the railroad offering fast, cheap transport, hunters had every reason to kill as many animals as they could. The scale of these operations grew rapidly. A typical professional hunting outfit might consist of a lead marksman, several skinners, a wagon driver, cooks, assistants, and sometimes even guards. The heart of the operation was the marksman. Armed with a powerful rifle, often a single-shot Sharps model, he could kill a bison from extraordinary distances. Skilled hunters learned how to approach herds from downwind, taking advantage of the animal's calm nature when undisturbed. A well-placed shot could cause a bison to drop instantly, without alarming the others. With patience and precision, a single hunter could kill dozens of animals in a morning. When the shooting stopped, the skinners approached the fallen animals. Their work was fast and unceremonious. They stripped the hides, leaving the rest of the carcass to decay under the sun. Some teams saved the tongues for sale as a delicacy. Others harvested bones for later shipment to fertilizer factories. But more often than not, the bulk of the animal was left untouched, a stark contrast to the practices of indigenous hunters who used nearly every part of the bison with intention and gratitude. As commercial hide hunting grew, the landscape of the plains began to change in visible and unsettling ways. Travelers reported seeing fields littered with bison carcasses, stretching far beyond the horizon. Wagon loads of hides traveled daily to railheads, where they were stacked in towering piles awaiting shipment. The herds, once too vast to count, began to thin in certain regions. Migratory patterns shifted. Where the ground once shook with the movement of thousands, now there were quiet stretches of grass where the bison no longer passed. For many indigenous nations, this transformation was deeply alarming. The bison had always been central to their way of life, and the sudden decline of the herds threatened food security, cultural traditions, and spiritual identity. Some tribes protested the hunters' behavior. Others attempted to defend the herds or limit hunting in certain areas. But the commercial operations were backed by profit and supported by the ease of railroad transportation. Their momentum was difficult to slow. Another force added pressure to this already strained landscape. The United States government, particularly in the decades after the Civil War, increasingly viewed the destruction of the bison as a strategic tool. Some military officers argued openly that breaking the power of the Plains tribes required removing their primary resource. Without the bison, the tribes would be forced to rely on government rations and accept confinement on reservations. This position was never made formal policy in a single document, but the logic appeared in letters, reports, and statements from influential leaders of the time. While commercial hunters were motivated by profit, federal authorities saw an opportunity to accelerate the collapse of the bison to achieve political goals. As the 1860s gave way to the 1870s, commercial hide hunting reached its peak. Some hunters boasted of killing 100 bison in a single day. Others took pride in the efficiency of their operations. Though a few voices expressed concern about the wastefulness and long-term consequences, most believed the herds were too numerous to ever disappear. The myth of endless abundance persisted even as the herds shrank dramatically. Imagine the plains during this moment. The sky is still wide. The grasses still ripple in the wind. But the sense of calm has changed. The land carries new scars. The bleached bones of bison begin to appear in greater numbers, scattered across the earth like remnants of a world slipping out of balance. The air still holds the soft hum of life, but layered beneath it is the knowledge that something ancient is being undone. Commercial hide hunting did not spread evenly. It began in the southern plains, in what is now Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. There, the herds fell with staggering speed. Hunters moved relentlessly across the region, supported by railroads like the Kansas Pacific and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. By the mid-1870s, the southern herd, once numbering millions, had nearly collapsed. When the hides became scarce in the South, the hunters turned their attention to the northern herds in Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. At each step, the pattern repeated. The hunters arrived. The hides were taken. The herds diminished. And the land, once shaped by the presence of millions of bison, slowly began to transform. Part 4 settles here, in the heart of this era of intense hunting. The forces that began as small ripples decades earlier have now gathered into a powerful current that sweeps across the plains with little resistance. In the next part, we will move gently into the northern plains and witness the final, painful contractions of the great herds. Part 5. The Fall of the Northern Herds. As we begin Part 5 of this quiet journey through the near extinction of the Great Plains bison, allow yourself to sink a bit deeper into restfulness. The evening cool settles gently over the grasslands, bringing with it a sense of stillness. Yet in the history we are exploring, this moment marks the beginning of the final and most devastating chapter for the bison. The southern herds have already collapsed under the weight of commercial hide hunting, and now the northern plains stand before us, vast and open, but increasingly fragile. Tonight, we drift softly into the story of the northern herds as they begin their precipitous fall. Picture the northern plains in the mid-1870s. These lands stretch across what is now Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and southern Canada. The winters are long and cold, the summers bright and wind-washed. The bison here, though part of the same species that roamed the southern prairies, lived in a world that felt slightly different. The herds moved across rugged hills, along winding rivers, and through broad valleys that carried echoes of ancient migrations. For a time, these northern herds remained relatively untouched. The distance from major rail lines offered a temporary buffer. The harsh winters made large-scale hunting more difficult. Indigenous nations who relied on these animals still followed their migrations with generations of knowledge and respect. But as the southern herds vanished, commercial hide hunters turned their attention northward. The demand for hides had not diminished. Factories still required leather. Tanneries still processed thousands of pelts every year. And the stories of wealth earned in the southern plains reached the ears of hunters eager to continue their work. By the late 1870s, the northern plains became the new frontier for the hide trade. The arrival of these hunters brought rapid and dramatic change. Armed with powerful rifles, organized into efficient outfits, and supported by increasingly accessible transportation routes, they began to take hides in staggering numbers. Some hunting teams established temporary camps along rivers like the Yellowstone, the Missouri, and the Powder. Others followed the rail lines that were slowly extending toward the northern plains. As each new stretch of track was laid, the hunters advanced with it, reaching deeper into territory that had previously been protected by its distance. The northern herds responded at first as they always had to human presence. They shifted their migration slightly, moved away from noise and activity, and attempted to avoid danger. But the scale and persistence of commercial hunting soon overwhelmed these natural instincts. Hunters tracked the herds across long distances, sometimes following them for weeks. Once a herd was spotted, the marksman would take careful positions, often using the rolling hills as cover. A skilled shooter could drop one animal after another before the herd fully understood the danger. When the shooting stopped, the landscape fell silent. Then the skinners went to work. Hides were stripped. Bones were left behind. Tens of thousands of carcasses began to accumulate across the northern plains. Travelers spoke of seeing fields of white bones stretching farther than the eye could follow, a stark and unsettling record of the speed at which change was happening. Indigenous nations in the northern plains felt the impact with alarming intensity. The bison were central not only to daily survival but to cultural identity, spiritual practice, and community structure. As the herds dwindled, the foundations of life began to fracture. Food scarcity increased. Winter hardships intensified. Long-standing traditions tied to the bison hunt were disrupted. Many leaders warned that the collapse of the herds would lead to profound cultural loss. Some attempted to negotiate for the protection of certain regions or herds, but the momentum of the hide trade was too powerful, supported by profit, expansion, and military influence. By the early 1880s, the northern plains witnessed one of the most intense periods of hide hunting in history. Accounts from this time describe enormous piles of hides awaiting transport at railheads in places like Miles City and Dickinson. Hunters often boasted of killing 100 bison in a single day. Some claimed even more. The numbers seemed almost impossible to sustain, yet the herds continued to fall, one after another, until the vast migrations that had once shaped the land began to break apart. The ecological impact was profound. Without the bison to graze the grasses in their traditional patterns, certain areas began to change. Plants that relied on periodic disturbance declined. Species that depended on the bison for food, shelter, or movement suffered as well. Wolves, which had long followed the herds, found fewer opportunities to hunt. Birds that nested in the wake of migrating bison saw their habitats diminish. The loss of the great herds rippled outward through the entire ecosystem, affecting every living thing that had once been connected to their presence. The fall of the northern herds contained moments of tragedy that became symbolic of the era. One of the most well-known involved the last large wild herd in the United States. In the winter of 1883 and 1884, this herd, numbering perhaps 1,000 animals, was pursued relentlessly by hide hunters. Despite harsh weather, despite difficult terrain, the hunters continued until nearly the entire herd was gone. Scenes like this were repeated across the northern plains until only small, scattered groups of bison remained, hiding in remote valleys or sheltered coulees. As the decade progressed, reports began circulating that the bison were nearly extinct. Some hunters who had once taken pride in their skills now expressed regret. Others simply moved on to new opportunities, leaving behind a landscape marked by deep loss. The northern plains, which had once echoed with the movement of millions of bison, grew quiet. In Canada, similar patterns unfolded, though in some regions conservation efforts began slightly earlier. Still, by the late 1880s, even the great northern herds that roamed between the United States and Canada had been reduced to a shadow of their former numbers. The entire species, once so abundant that early travelers believed it could never be diminished, now stood at the edge of survival. Tonight, as Part 5 comes to rest, imagine the plains as they appeared at the end of this devastating chapter. The sky is still wide. The wind still moves softly through the grass. But the land feels emptier. The bison are no longer the steady pulse of this world. Instead, the plains hold the quiet memory of what once was. In our next part, we will drift into the near-final collapse of the species, tracing the moments when extinction felt almost certain. Part 6. The Edge of Extinction. As we continue this quiet journey together, I invite you to let the pace of your breathing slow, settling once more into the stillness of the Great Plains. The grasses move softly in the wind. The horizon stretches in a long, unbroken line. But in the history we are exploring, the world has grown quiet in a different way. By the time we reach the late 1880s, the bison, once so abundant that they covered the land like a living tide, have been reduced to a fragile remnant. Tonight, in Part 6, we drift gently into this somber chapter when extinction hovered close enough to touch. Imagine the plains at this moment in history. Only a few decades earlier, the land had moved with incredible life. The ground trembled under the weight of countless herds. Their migration shaped the soil, the plants, the predators, and the people who lived in harmony with them. But now, as the 19th century begins its final stretch, the plains feel emptier. The silence grows deeper. Carcasses have been bleached by the sun, their bones scattered across valleys, hillsides, and riverbanks. The once vast herds have vanished from most of their ancient ranges. The decline has happened with such speed that many people of the time struggle to comprehend it. In the early 1800s, tens of millions of bison roamed across the continent. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained in the wild. Some estimates place the number even lower. To stand on the plains at this moment would be to witness the near disappearance of a species that had shaped the land for thousands of years. Several forces converged to push the bison to this brink. Commercial hide hunting had already taken a staggering toll, reducing both the southern and northern herds with unprecedented speed. Military pressure, federal policies, and the expansion of railroads accelerated the collapse by making it easier for hunters to reach previously inaccessible regions. The introduction of market demands transformed the bison from a keystone species into a commodity. Within this economic machine, the animals could not reproduce quickly enough to keep pace with the scale of killing. There is a quiet sense of disbelief that settles over this chapter. Many who lived on or near the plains remembered the herds as an overwhelming force of nature. They spoke of migrations that lasted for days, of herds so dense that one could walk across them as though crossing a solid mass of earth and hide. Now, those same observers rode across empty fields and valleys, searching for animals that were no longer there. Travelers described a strange, uneasy silence that replaced the thunder of hooves. The land felt altered, not only in its appearance, but in its spirit. Indigenous nations were among the most deeply affected by this loss. For countless generations, the bison had been at the center of cultural identity, providing food, shelter, tools, and spiritual meaning. The decline of the herds created immediate hardship, but it also created a profound sense of grief. Families faced hunger. Traditions tied to the hunt and the seasonal cycles were interrupted. Ceremonial practices had to adapt to a world where the animals that once stood at the heart of their existence were nearly gone. Some indigenous leaders wrote or spoke about the emotional weight of this loss. They described the bison not merely as animals, but as relatives, as gifts from the land, as beings whose disappearance marked the end of a world their ancestors had known. The pain was layered. It included the loss of food security, the unraveling of cultural rhythms, and the dismantling of ways of life enforced through confinement on reservations. The near extinction of the bison was not a single event, but part of a much larger and more painful transformation unfolding across the plains. Meanwhile, some American voices began to express concern. Articles appeared in newspapers describing the collapse of the herds. A few politicians and naturalists suggested that the species needed protection. But these calls were often too late, and they were always too small compared to the overwhelming pressures that had brought the herds to this point. The last remaining bison in the United States survived in small, isolated pockets. One tiny group lived in the newly established Yellowstone National Park. Another survived in a remote corner of northern Montana. A few more wandered inside deep ravines or inaccessible valleys, hiding from hunters by chance more than by design. These surviving animals were few in number and genetically vulnerable. The idea that the species could recover seemed uncertain at best, impossible at worst. The story of Yellowstone's bison offers a quiet but important moment in this chapter. By the early 1880s, only a few dozen wild bison remained in the park. Poachers continued to enter the area despite its protected status. They killed the animals for hides or meat, leaving carcasses behind in places that were sometimes startlingly close to ranger stations. The park struggled to enforce meaningful protection, hindered by limited resources and legal ambiguity. Yet somehow, a small herd managed to survive, a flicker of life in an era when the species stood closer to extinction than ever before. Other small groups survived only through private efforts. A rancher in Texas named Charles Goodnight, for example, kept a tiny herd alive on his property, understanding that he was preserving something ancient and precious. Another herd was maintained near Manitoba by a man named Michel Pablo and his partner Charles Allard. Their animals, descendants of a captured wild calf, would later play an important role in rebuilding the species. But these little pockets of survival felt fragile. The plains, once so deeply shaped by the bison, no longer echoed with their presence. The ecological effects of their disappearance were widespread. Grasslands grew in ways they had not before. Predators that had depended on the herds dwindled or changed their behaviors. The soil itself, which had been aerated and enriched by millions of hooves, began to shift in composition. The loss of the bison was not only a cultural and economic tragedy. It was an ecological one as well. As we rest at the end of Part 6, imagine once more the quietness of the plains at this moment in history. The wind still moves. The sky still stretches like an ocean above the earth. But the land feels altered, holding the echo of a life that is nearly gone. The story of the bison has reached its darkest point, yet within this darkness, faint signs of resilience begin to emerge. In our next part, we will trace the earliest efforts to protect the remaining animals, efforts that would eventually shape the future of the species. Part 7. The first sparks of protection. As we move gently into Part 7 of this quiet story, I invite you once again to slow your breath and let the plains unfold calmly in your mind. The bison have reached their lowest point. The great herds that once shaped the continent have dwindled almost to nothing. The land holds a deep stillness, and yet, within that stillness, something begins to stir. A small, fragile hope emerges, not loud or triumphant, but quiet and persistent. Tonight, we drift into the earliest efforts to protect the remaining bison, efforts that may seem small at first glance, but that will eventually help lift the species back from the edge of extinction. Imagine the plains in the late 1880s. The emptiness is profound. Travelers ride or walk across long stretches of grass and encounter no herds. Instead, they see bones scattered across the soil, bleaching slowly under the sun. The bison, once so numerous that their migration seemed eternal, now survive only in tiny pockets, scattered and vulnerable. Many believe that the species will soon be gone forever. Yet in the midst of this bleak landscape, a few individuals begin to recognize the gravity of what has happened and the importance of what might still be saved. One of the earliest and most significant sparks of protection comes from Yellowstone National Park. Established in 1872, the park was still in its infancy at the time of the bison's collapse. Many early visitors saw Yellowstone as a wilderness to be enjoyed, but not necessarily preserved in the modern sense. Laws were unclear. Enforcement was minimal. Poachers slipped in easily. They killed bison within park boundaries, just as they had outside them, and sold the hides for profit. By the early 1880s, the Yellowstone herd had fallen to perhaps only a few dozen animals. The near extinction of this last wild herd stirred concern in certain circles. Park officials, naturalists, and a small number of politicians began to argue that the bison needed real, enforceable protection. Their voices were quiet at first, overshadowed by the economic forces that had driven the species to such a low point. Yet these voices carried sincerity and a sense of responsibility. They believed that if the bison disappeared entirely, something sacred and irreplaceable would be lost from the American landscape. In 1894, their concerns finally became law when Congress passed the Lacey Act, a piece of legislation that gave Yellowstone real authority to protect its wildlife. This act marked one of the first significant federal steps toward conservation. It did not immediately solve every problem. Poachers still operated in the park, and resources remained limited. But for the first time, the United States had formally recognized the importance of preserving the bison. This recognition, fragile though it was, became a foundation for everything that followed. While Yellowstone carried the responsibility of safeguarding one of the last wild herds, private individuals also stepped forward in their own quiet ways. On the plains of Texas, a rancher named Charles Goodnight and his wife, Mary Ann, maintained a small herd of bison on their ranch after realizing how rapidly the species was vanishing. Their herd began with only a few survivors, yet in time it grew into one of the most important seed populations for future conservation. These early efforts were not grand in scale. They were not coordinated or directed by any national strategy. Instead, they were carried forward by people who felt a personal connection to the bison and understood that they were witnessing the end of something profound. These individuals acted on instinct, on compassion, and on a sense of historical awareness. They cared for the remaining animals in an era when many had already accepted extinction as inevitable. In Montana, another spark of protection came from the efforts of Michel Pablo and Charles Allard, two men of the Flathead Reservation who had assembled a herd of bison descended from a captured calf. Their herd grew slowly but steadily, thriving on the reservation and becoming one of the largest remaining private collections in North America. Pablo and Allard did not initially see themselves as conservationists in the modern sense. They were ranchers and land stewards. But their work quietly preserved a genetic legacy that would later become essential to the species' recovery. These scattered efforts might appear small when viewed individually, like faint lanterns flickering across a dark plain. But together they represented something powerful. They were the first signs of human responsibility toward a species that had suffered largely because of human actions. They signaled a shift in cultural consciousness, a recognition that the bison were not an inexhaustible resource but a living treasure that deserved care and protection. The ecological repercussions of the bison's decline also influenced these early sentiments. Scientists and naturalists observed that without the bison, the prairie changed in noticeable ways. Certain grasses grew unchecked while others withered. Soil compacted differently. The movements of predators shifted. The intricate balance that had defined the plains for centuries was unraveling. These observations helped fuel a growing appreciation for the ecological role of the bison, though such ideas were still forming and far from widespread. By the early 1890s, the bison population reached its lowest point in recorded history. fewer than 1,000 survived across the entire continent. Some estimates place the number closer to a few hundred. The species was no longer simply endangered. It was nearly gone. And yet, here and there, people continued to work quietly to protect what remained. One of the more remarkable shifts of this era came in the form of public sentiment. Articles began appearing in newspapers describing the tragic disappearance of the bison. Painters and writers memorialized the animals in their work, capturing the majesty of what had been lost. Their depictions carried a sense of mourning but also a call for awareness. These cultural expressions, though gentle in tone, helped plant the seeds of conservation in the minds of the public. It is important to remember that none of these early efforts guaranteed the survival of the species. The bison remained incredibly vulnerable. Their numbers were too small to ensure genetic health. The lands on which they survived were limited. The cultural and economic pressures that had driven them to the brink had not disappeared. And yet, these small efforts mattered deeply. They kept the species alive long enough for a broader movement to emerge in the decades to come. So Part 7 rests here, in a moment where the bison still hover close to extinction, yet faint glimmers of protection have begun to appear across the plains. The herds are tiny. The future is uncertain. But the story has shifted from one of inevitable decline to one of fragile possibility. Part 8. The dawning of organized conservation. As we drift gently into Part 8 of this story, allow yourself to settle into a slow and peaceful rhythm. The night around us grows quiet, and the vast plains stretch softly beneath starlight. The bison remain few in number, holding on in scattered pockets across the continent. Yet out of this near silence, out of the heavy stillness that followed their collapse, something new begins to take shape. It is the quiet emergence of organized conservation, a movement that at first seems fragile and uncertain, but one that would eventually help secure the survival of this ancient species. Imagine the 1890s unfolding like a long exhale. The country had spent decades pushing westward, building railroads, establishing towns, and developing new industries. Much of this expansion had come at a cost to the natural world, and only now were people beginning to understand the magnitude of that cost. The near disappearance of the bison shocked many Americans. It became one of the first widely recognized examples of how a nation's growth could unravel something irreplaceable. This recognition opened the door to a new way of thinking. Slowly, quietly, people began to ask whether some parts of the natural world should be protected, not exploited. The earliest conservationists did not see themselves as part of a formal movement. They simply felt compelled to act. Among them were naturalists, explorers, artists, scientists, and a few government leaders. Their motivations varied. Some felt a deep emotional connection to the bison and mourned their disappearance. Others recognized the ecological consequences of losing such a keystone species. Still others believed that preserving wildlife would strengthen national identity, offering future generations a way to understand the landscapes that had shaped the country's earliest years. One of the most influential voices in this emerging movement was a sculptor and naturalist named William Temple Hornaday. In the 1880s, Hornaday traveled to the West to document and collect specimens of the nearly vanished bison for the Smithsonian Institution. What he witnessed shocked him deeply. The empty plains, the scattered bones, the few remaining animals hiding in remote valleys. It felt to Hornaday like walking through the remnants of a broken world. When he returned east, he was no longer merely a collector. He had become a fierce advocate for bison protection. Hornaday's work helped inspire the creation of the American Bison Society, a group dedicated to rebuilding the species. Though the society would not be officially founded until 1905, the seeds of its formation were planted in the 1890s. Hornaday wrote articles and reports urging Americans to recognize their responsibility to the natural world. He argued that the bison should not simply be remembered as symbols of the past, but should be restored as living creatures with a future on the continent they once shaped. These early calls for conservation found support among other influential voices. Artists like Frederick Remington captured the image of the bison in paintings that reached audiences who might never see the plains with their own eyes. Writers described the tragedy of their disappearance in ways that stirred empathy. Scientists began documenting the ecological importance of the species. Even a few political leaders, including President Theodore Roosevelt, took interest in what the bison represented. Roosevelt had grown up fascinated by the wildlife of the American West. Though he was not yet president, his emerging influence supported the growing idea that wildlife deserved protection. At the same time, the small private herds maintained by individuals like Charles Goodnight, Michel Pablo, and Charles Allard were becoming more widely recognized as essential to the species' future. These herds had survived the worst decades of the collapse. They represented a living thread connecting the present to the ancient past. Ranchers, naturalists, and early conservationists began discussing ways to bring these herds together, to protect them more formally, and to increase their numbers for future restoration. Yellowstone National Park also played a quietly important role in the dawning of organized conservation. Even after the Lacey Act strengthened its ability to protect wildlife, the park struggled with poaching and limited resources. Yet the small herd that survived there proved resilient. Their presence offered evidence that wild bison could still live on the plains if given space and protection. These Yellowstone bison became a symbol of hope, a living reminder that not everything had been lost. As the decade progressed, public awareness grew stronger. Newspaper articles described the bison not only as victims of overhunting, but as a species worthy of care. School children learned about the animal in textbooks that framed them as part of the nation's heritage. Travelers visiting Yellowstone felt gratitude when they glimpsed a bison wandering through the steam of a distant geyser. Slowly, the idea of conservation began to move from the fringes of conversation to something broadly accepted. This shift in public sentiment reflected something deeper as well. Americans were beginning to understand the lands around them not only as resources to be used, but as places with intrinsic value. The closing of the frontier, declared by the U.S. Census Bureau in 1890, changed the nation's self-image. The idea of endless open land had shaped generations of settlers. But now, people were beginning to see the natural world as finite, delicate, and deserving of protection. The bison became a powerful symbol of this new awareness. If the bison could fall, then other species could too. And if the bison could be saved, perhaps something important about the country itself could be preserved. Yet even in this quiet dawn of organized conservation, the work was far from complete. The number of surviving bison was still dangerously small. Their genetic diversity was limited. Their habitat had been dramatically reduced. The forces that had nearly destroyed them had not disappeared. Railroads still crossed the plains. Settlers continued to graze livestock on former bison ranges. Market economies still shaped land use. The path to recovery would be long and uncertain. But in this moment, the story had changed direction. The rapid decline had slowed. The possibility of a future for the bison, once nearly impossible to imagine, now began to expand. the early conservationists did not yet know how their efforts would unfold. They worked quietly, patiently, with the understanding that any step toward protection was meaningful. So Part 8 rests gently here, at the beginning of a new chapter in the story of the Great Plains bison. The herds are still small. The challenges remain immense. But for the first time in many decades, the story carries a thread of hope, soft and steady like a lantern glowing across the darkened plains. Part 9. A national movement takes shape. As we continue together into Part 9 of this quiet journey, I invite you to imagine the landscape around us settling into an evening hush. The plains lie calm under a sky beginning to gather stars, and the world feels softened by distance and time. The bison remain few, yet the faint sparks of protection we explored in the last part are beginning to glow more steadily. What began as scattered acts of individual compassion is slowly evolving into something larger. Tonight, we drift into the moment when the United States begins to organize its first true national movement to save the bison from extinction. Let yourself breathe slowly as the 1890s fade and the 20th century approaches. The American West has changed dramatically. Towns, railroads, and ranches now fill areas that once held uninterrupted stretches of wild prairie. The old frontier has closed. The age of expansion, so influential in shaping the previous century, has given way to an age of reflection. Americans are beginning to look back at the landscapes they transformed and noticing the consequences of their actions. And among all the losses the country has witnessed, the near disappearance of the bison stands out as especially symbolic. In these years, the idea of conservation begins to take shape not only as a personal duty but as a national responsibility. Influential voices in politics, science, and art speak more openly about the need to protect wildlife. Nature writing grows in popularity. Newspapers carry stories about declining species and disappearing landscapes. Slowly, the notion that humans should act as stewards of the natural world gains acceptance. The bison, majestic and nearly gone, becomes a perfect emblem for this emerging philosophy. One of the central figures in this growing movement is William Temple Hornaday. Having witnessed the devastation of the herds firsthand, Hornaday dedicates much of his life to raising public awareness. His book, The Extermination of the American Bison, published in 1889, becomes one of the era's most influential works on conservation. It is an impassioned call to action, filled with detailed accounts of the bison's decline. The book travels widely, stirring emotions and inspiring conversations across the country. Hornaday's writing, though sobering, carries a message of possibility. He argues that the bison can still be saved if people act quickly and decisively. This message resonates with naturalists, ranchers, and policymakers who are beginning to recognize that the fate of the species rests in their hands. Hornaday's efforts lay the groundwork for future collaboration, and his voice becomes one of the clearest in the early conservation movement. Another powerful influence arises in the form of Theodore Roosevelt, a man whose connection to the American West runs deep. Roosevelt spends years ranching in the Dakota Territory, riding across the northern plains and observing firsthand the land that once nourished great herds. He witnesses the emptiness that follows the bison's collapse. These experiences leave a lasting mark on him. When Roosevelt later rises to national political power, he brings with him a strong belief that wildlife deserves protection. Though he is not yet president during this period of our story, his growing influence helps turn conservation into a matter of national pride and policy. The public mood is shifting as well. Schools begin teaching children about the bison as part of the country's natural heritage. museums display taxidermy mounts that stand not only as scientific specimens but as reminders of what has been lost. Photographs and illustrations circulate widely, showing both the beauty of the living bison and the sorrowful scenes of bones scattered across the plains. Even those who have never seen a wild herd begin to feel a sense of responsibility. All of these currents gather and strengthen until, in the early 1900s, they converge in a remarkable way. In 1905, the American Bison Society is founded, with Hornaday and Roosevelt among its leading members. The Society's mission is simple yet ambitious: to rebuild the bison population and return the species to the landscapes it once shaped. The creation of the American Bison Society marks the first organized, nationwide effort to protect a native species from extinction. Its formation is a turning point. The Society brings together ranchers, naturalists, zoologists, government officials, and citizens from across the country. They raise funds, purchase land, arrange the transport of animals, and develop strategies for breeding and releasing bison into protected environments. One of their first major projects involves the Bronx Zoo in New York, where Hornaday works as director. There, a small breeding herd is assembled with animals donated from private ranchers, including the Goodnight herd of Texas. These bison are cared for with great attention, their offspring raised in conditions meant to preserve their health and genetic diversity. This herd becomes a vital reservoir for future restoration efforts. In 1907, the Society organizes a historic event. 15 bison from the Bronx Zoo are transported by rail to the Wichita Mountain Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. The journey captures the imagination of the public. Newspapers describe the bison as honored passengers on a symbolic trip westward, returning to a land where their ancestors once roamed by the millions. When the animals arrive in Oklahoma, they step onto protected soil that will become one of the first strongholds for the rebounding species. Similar projects soon follow. Bison are sent to refuges in Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska. The Pablo Allard herd, one of the most important private herds surviving from the 19th century, is purchased by the Canadian government and relocated to what will eventually become Elk Island National Park in Alberta. These animals form the foundation of Canada's conservation efforts and remain crucial to the species' recovery. Scientists begin studying the remaining bison more carefully, documenting their biology, behavior, and habitat needs. Ecologists recognize the animals' importance in maintaining grassland ecosystems. This scientific understanding provides further justification for protection and restoration. What began as a movement driven by emotion and concern increasingly becomes supported by research and ecological awareness. Yet the path forward remains fragile. The number of surviving bison is still low, and the genetic pool is limited. The land they once roamed is now carved into private property, fenced, farmed, and grazed by domestic cattle. Restoring the species on anything close to its former scale seems impossible. And yet, the work continues. The early conservationists know that even if the bison can never return in their historical numbers, preserving them as a living species is an achievement worthy of every effort. So Part 9 settles here, in a moment when the tide has finally begun to turn. The bison are not yet safe, but for the first time in nearly a century, they are moving forward rather than backward. The plains are still quiet, but beneath that quietness, life is slowly returning. It begins with small herds, protected lands, and the steady work of people who believe that something precious can be saved. Part 10. Small herds, slow recovery. As we begin Part 10 of this quiet journey, let yourself sink a little deeper into restfulness. The winds of the plains drift gently through your imagination, carrying the soft scent of grass and the faint echo of ancient migrations. The bison are still few, still fragile, yet no longer fading. The early years of the 20th century bring something the species has not known for generations: protection, patience, and a cautious but growing sense of hope. Tonight, we drift into the era of slow recovery, when small herds began to breathe new life into a landscape that had almost forgotten their presence. Imagine the plains in the years just after 1907. The land is still vast, still open, still shaped by wide horizons and quiet evenings. But the bison no longer appear across these spaces in endless waves. Instead, they exist in small pockets. They graze in fence refuges, in private ranch lands, and in scattered preserves where attentive caretakers watch over them with genuine care. For the first time in decades, human beings are working with the intention of nurturing the species, rather than exploiting it. One of the most important sanctuaries of this time is the Wichita Mountain Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. The herd that arrived from the Bronx Zoo quickly adapted to the rolling grasslands. Rangers monitored the animals carefully, ensuring they had access to food, water, and protection. Though the herd was small, it represented a beginning. Each calf born here carried the promise of future generations. The bison, long accustomed to roaming freely across continents, now lived within protective boundaries. Yet even in this reduced space, the instinctive rhythm of their lives began to return. Around this same time, Yellowstone National Park's tiny herd continued to survive, thanks to new enforcement measures and growing public awareness. Rangers patrolled more diligently. Laws protecting wildlife were more firmly applied. And the public began to see Yellowstone's bison not as relics of the past, but as treasured survivors whose fate was tied to the identity of the nation itself. Still, the herd remained dangerously small. In some years, only a handful of calves were born. Disease, poaching, harsh winters, and genetic limitations all posed threats to these last wild plains bison. The early conservationists knew that rebuilding a species from such small numbers would be a slow and uncertain process. They understood that the survival of the bison depended not only on preserving individual animals, but on protecting sufficient habitat. The plains had changed dramatically since the days when millions of bison roamed freely. Much of the land was now occupied by cattle ranches, farms, and growing towns. Rail lines cut across migratory pathways. Fences restricted movement. Restoring the bison to anything resembling their former range was unlikely. But within the pockets of land available, recovery, slow, modest, and steady, was possible. The American Bison Society coordinated breeding programs, land acquisitions, and scientific research. Members traveled across the country to study the remaining herds and identify suitable areas for new refuges. They raised funds, educated the public, and worked closely with government agencies to secure protections. No single step was dramatic, but together these efforts built a foundation that allowed the species to endure. Private ranchers also played an important role in this recovery. Some cared for bison because they saw value in preserving a symbol of the Old West. Others believed that the animals could eventually be raised for meat or hides in sustainable ways, distinct from the destructive hunting of the previous century. Though their motivations varied, many ranchers maintained careful, well-managed herds that contributed to the genetic diversity of the species. These ranches, scattered across states like Texas, Montana, New Mexico, and Colorado, created small but vital refuges where bison could grow in number. Meanwhile, Canada made significant progress through the purchase of the Pablo Allard herd. After years of negotiation, These animals were transported north to what would become Elk Island National Park in Alberta. They thrived there in a sanctuary well suited to their needs. Over time, the herd expanded enough that it would later help repopulate other parts of North America. As these scattered herds grew, researchers began learning more about bison behavior and ecology. They observed how the animals grazed in patterns that encouraged diverse plant growth. They documented the complex social structures within herds. They studied how bison shaped ecosystems through their movements, their feeding habits, and even their wallowing behavior. Slowly, a deeper appreciation for the ecological importance of bison emerged, strengthening the argument for protecting and restoring them. Yet even as recovery began, challenges remained. The genetic bottleneck caused by near extinction meant that modern bison descended from only a small fraction of their original population. This limited diversity made the animals more vulnerable to disease. In some herds, cattle genes had been introduced through earlier crossbreeding attempts, creating debate about how to preserve the genetic integrity of the species. Land availability also continued to limit the size of wild herds. Many places where bison once thrived were now densely settled or used intensively for agriculture. Still, the early decades of the 20th century marked a turning point. The story was no longer one of rapid decline, but of cautious renewal. The herds remained small, but they were stable. They remained scattered, but no longer in immediate danger of disappearing. With each passing year, new calves were born. With each passing decade, new refuges were established. The bison were not returning to their old world, but they were finding a place in the new one. Imagine now a quiet morning on the Wichita Mountains Refuge. The sun rises slowly, painting the landscape in soft gold. A small herd moves across the grass, their shapes calm and powerful. Calves stay close to their mothers, their coats are warm reddish-brown. The older bulls stand watchfully at a distance, their great heads lowered as they graze. The land is peaceful. The animals feel secure. It is a gentle scene, simple yet profound, because it represents something once nearly lost forever. So part 10 rests here, in the steady calm of small herds beginning to recover. It is not yet a triumphant moment, but it is a hopeful one. The work of restoration has begun. The species has stepped back from the brink. And the land, which once echoed with their absence, now holds the soft and growing pulse of bison life once more. Part 11. A species steps into the modern era. As we drift gently into part 11 of this long and quiet journey, I invite you to relax into a peaceful rhythm once again. The bison, having survived their darkest chapter, now stand at the threshold of the modern era. Their numbers remain small, their genetic lines delicate, yet their presence is no longer fading. Instead, the species is beginning to settle into a new place in a changing world. Tonight, we explore how the bison entered the 20th century, navigating both the hopeful beginnings of recovery and the complexities that came with a new age. Imagine the early decades of the 1900s spreading out across the plains like a soft morning light. The land has changed, shaped by ranches, farms, roads, and the quiet hum of modern life. The bison no longer roam freely across thousands of miles, but they are no longer vanishing. Protected herds in refuges and private ranches are slowly growing. Calves appear each spring, their presence a gentle signal that the species has begun to rebuild itself. For the first time in over a century, people are talking not only about saving the bison from extinction, but about how the species might fit into a modern landscape. These conversations begin in conservation offices, scientific journals, and ranch houses. they carry a mixture of hope, caution, and curiosity. The world is no longer one where bison can wander unimpeded across the plains. Yet it is a world that increasingly recognizes the value of wild creatures and the importance of ecological balance. One of the central challenges of this era is determining how best to manage small, scattered herds. Many early conservationists believe that protected refuges are the key. Places like the Wichita Mountain Wildlife Refuge, Yellowstone National Park, and the newly formed National Bison Range in Montana become strongholds for the species. These refuges provide food, shelter, and legal protections that allow herds to grow without the constant threat of hunting or habitat loss. The National Bison Range, created in 1908, becomes especially important. Located in the Flathead Valley, this refuge offers rich grazing lands and enough space for a herd to develop in relative security. Animals from private herds, including those from the Pablo Alad line, are brought to the refuge to establish a population with strong genetic roots. The creation of this refuge marks one of the earliest examples of the United States setting land aside specifically for endangered wildlife. As the herds begin to grow, scientists take a more active interest in understanding the species. They study herd dynamics, reproduction rates, social structures, diet patterns, and ecological roles. This research reveals something profound: the bison is not merely a survivor of the past, but a keystone species that helps shape the very land it inhabits. Their grazing encourages the growth of diverse grasses. Their wallows create microhabitats for plants and insects. Their movement spreads seeds and open pathways for countless other species. The ecological value of the bison becomes clearer with each passing study. At the same time, ranchers continue to maintain private herds. Some raise bison because they feel a deep respect for the animal and wish to preserve it. Others view bison ranching as an economic opportunity. Bison meat, hides, and skulls gain renewed interest in certain markets. This creates an unusual blend of conservation and commercial activity. While these ranches do not contribute directly to wild populations, they help preserve genetic diversity and keep public interest in the species strong. However, the modern era brings challenges that differ from those of the past. One of these challenges is the question of genetics. Because the bison population was rebuilt from such a small number of surviving animals, genetic diversity remains limited. Some early ranchers attempted to crossbreed bison with cattle, hoping to create animals suited for beef production. Though these experiments were largely abandoned, they left behind herds with traces of cattle DNA. Conservationists now face the delicate task of determining which populations should be considered genetically pure and how best to manage breeding to preserve the species' identity. Another challenge comes from the changing landscape itself. Much of the bison's former range has been transformed by agriculture and development. Domestic cattle graze across millions of acres once used by bison. Fences restrict movement. Busy roads make wide-scale migrations impossible. The bison must adapt to smaller, managed spaces, creating a new relationship between humans and wildlife that requires careful planning. In Yellowstone, the herd continues to grow, but not without difficulties. Harsh winters, disease concerns, and ongoing debates about grazing rights shape the management policies of the park. Brucellosis, a disease that can be transmitted from bison to cattle, becomes a point of tension between ranchers and wildlife officials. These debates highlight a central theme of the modern era: how to balance ecological protection with the needs and concerns of human communities living nearby. Despite these challenges, the early to mid-20th century remains a period of steady progress for the bison. Herds at refuges expand slowly. Private ranches continue to grow. Public awareness deepens. The bison becomes a symbol of national resilience. Children learn about the species in school. Images of the bison appear on coins, seals, and logos. The animal that once stood on the edge of extinction has now become part of the country's identity, representing both the beauty of the natural world and the responsibility to protect it. Imagine now a quiet evening at the National Bison Range. The sun is lowering, casting warm light across the grasslands. A herd moves slowly through the fading glow, calves trotting beside their mothers, older bulls grazing at the edge of the group. The air is calm. The land feels steady. For the first time in centuries, the bison's future holds more hope than uncertainty. These small herds, though limited in space and number, are living symbols of a species that has endured loss on a scale few can comprehend. Yet the story is not complete. The modern era introduces new complexities, new debates, and new challenges that require thoughtful, long-term solutions. But the species is alive. It has stepped into a new chapter not as an echo of the past, but as a living presence on the land. So part 11 rests here, in the quiet light of a species finding its place in the modern world. In the next part, we will explore the deep ecological significance of the bison and how scientists began to understand just how profoundly these animals shape the landscapes they inhabit. Part 12. The ecological engine of the plains. As we begin part 12 of this soft and steady journey, allow your breath to slow and deepen once more. The plains open before us like a quiet sea of grass, stretching under a sky that holds the gentle hues of early evening. The bison have survived the worst of their ordeal. Their numbers remain modest, their herds carefully managed, yet their presence now offers something more than hope. It offers insight. In the soft decades of the 20th century, scientists and conservationists begin to understand that the bison is not merely a large grazing animal. The bison is an ecological engine, a living force that shapes the land in ways both subtle and profound. Tonight, we drift into that understanding, exploring how the return of even small herds revealed the deep and ancient connection between the bison and the Great Plains. Imagine walking across a patch of prairie on a calm morning. The grass rustles softly against your legs. The earth beneath your feet feels firm yet springy, enriched by centuries of life pressing into it. On the horizon, a small herd of bison grazes quietly. To the untrained eye, they seem to simply eat and wander. But to those who study the land, every movement they make carries meaning. Each bite, each hoof step, even each moment they lie down to rest plays a role in shaping the ecosystem around them. The early scientists of the 20th century began documenting these connections, often surprised by the depth of influence the animals held. They noticed, for example, that bison grazing encouraged the growth of a wide variety of grasses. Unlike domestic cattle, which tend to crop vegetation more closely and heavily, bison graze in shifting patterns. They move frequently, nibbling here and there before drifting onward. This behavior prevents overgrazing and creates patches of grass at different heights, supporting a mosaic of plant life and the insects, birds, and mammals that depend on it. Another discovery involved the bison's iconic wallows. These shallow depressions, created when animals roll on the ground to scratch or cover themselves in dust, might appear insignificant to a casual observer. Yet each wallow collects rainwater in spring, creating temporary wetlands that nourish amphibians, insects, and moisture-loving plants. Scientists found that wallows scattered across the plains acted almost like tiny oases, supporting life that would otherwise struggle to thrive. A single herd could influence the landscape across thousands of acres simply through these instinctive behaviors. Researchers also documented how bison movements helped spread native seeds. As the animals walked, seeds clung to their thick coats or lodged in the mud beneath their hooves. Carrying these seeds across long distances, the bison acted as large, gentle gardeners. Their migrations ensured that prairie plants maintained genetic diversity and expanded into new areas. This process had been a quiet heartbeat of the plains for thousands of years but had gone unnoticed until the herds began to grow again. In Yellowstone, where the herd persisted in a semi-wild state, scientists gained further insight. They observed how bison used thermal areas in winter, warming themselves near geysers and hot springs when the cold became intense. Their presence in these zones opened pathways through deep snow that other animals could follow. Elk, pronghorn, wolves, and even small rodents depended on these bison trails during the hardest months of the year. The movement of one species shaped the survival of many others. These discoveries carried a message that resonated through the growing field of ecology. The bison was not simply a large animal that once occupied the plains. The bison was a keystone species, one whose presence had profound effects on the structure and function of the entire ecosystem. Without the bison, the land behaved differently. The grasses grew in unfamiliar patterns. Predators shifted their habits. Birds lost nesting grounds. Insects lost food sources. Soil composition changed. The plains were not merely a backdrop for the bison. They were a living partner in a relationship that had endured since the end of the last ice age. This understanding strengthened the conservation movement. It gave new purpose to the efforts of scientists, policymakers, and private landowners. Protecting the bison was no longer viewed as an act of sentiment or historical preservation. It was a commitment to preserving the ecological health of one of the continent's great landscapes. If the bison could be restored, then much of the prairie could be restored with them. Yet challenges remained. The grasslands themselves were shrinking. Agriculture had transformed vast stretches of the plains into fields of wheat, corn, and other crops. Urban areas had expanded. Roads and fences blocked ancient migratory trails. Even in protected areas, the bison's habitat was often limited by the boundaries of parks or refuges. Scientists and land managers debated how best to balance ecological needs with modern realities. Could bison be allowed to roam more freely? Could ranch lands and conservation lands coexist? Could the species ever return to something resembling its ancient role? These questions did not have simple answers. But they sparked a new kind of conversation, one that blended ecology, ethics, economics, and community values. They encouraged people to imagine landscapes where wildness still held a place. They inspired long-term planning and collaborations across states, provinces, tribal nations, and private ranches. One of the most important voices in these discussions came from indigenous communities. For many tribes, the return of the bison was not only an ecological or cultural interest. It was a living restoration of a relationship broken by centuries of disruption. Tribal nations began developing their own conservation herds, integrating traditional knowledge with modern science. These herds carried both ecological meaning and spiritual significance, reconnecting communities with practices and values tied to the bison for countless generations. In the decades to come, these tribal-led efforts would become vital to the species' health and genetic diversity. So Part 12 rests here, in a moment when the bison is understood not simply as a survivor of past tragedy, but as a teacher and a partner in understanding the prairie itself. The species remains small in number, yet its influence ripples outward through grasslands, through ecosystems, through scientific understanding, and through cultural renewal. The story now moves toward a future where restoration becomes more ambitious, more thoughtful, and more deeply connected to the land's ancient rhythms. Part 13. Restoration across new landscapes. As we move gently into Part 13 of this long, peaceful story, let the rhythm of your breath remain slow and steady. The plains open once more before us, shaped by both memory and renewal. The bison, once reduced to the edge of extinction, have begun to reclaim small corners of their ancient world. Their numbers are still limited, but their influence is growing. In this chapter, we explore how restoration efforts spread across new landscapes during the later 20th century, and how the bison began to step quietly into a broader role in conservation and cultural renewal. Imagine the 1960s and 1970s settling over the prairies. The world is changing in many ways. Environmental awareness is rising. People are beginning to understand the fragility of ecosystems and the far-reaching consequences of human activity. The first Earth Day is celebrated. National parks expand their missions. New laws protect endangered species. And across this shifting landscape of ideas, the bison re-emerge as a symbol of resilience and responsibility. By this time, small herds have been established in several refuges and parks across the United States and Canada. These herds vary in size, but many are strong enough to provide a foundation for expansion. Scientists and conservationists begin to think not only about preserving the species, but about restoring the ecological relationships the bison once nurtured. They wonder what it would mean for the plains if bison returned to more of their native habitats. They explore where the animals might thrive, where the land could sustain them, and where communities might welcome their presence. Some of the earliest large-scale restoration efforts take place on public lands. In South Dakota, Wind Cave National Park becomes home to a carefully managed herd descended from some of the earliest conservation lineages. Wind Cave's wide valleys and rolling hills provide ideal grazing lands. As the herd grows, scientists observe how the animals interact with the landscape, promoting plant diversity, supporting wildlife, and shaping the ecosystem in ways reminiscent of ancient times. In Montana, the National Bison Range continues to develop as a protective sanctuary. Its herds maintain genetic lines connected to the Pablo Allard and Goodnight animals. The range becomes a living classroom for scientists, artists, and visitors who come to see what the Great Plains looked like before fences and highways transformed the land. Over the years, the refuge becomes deeply involved in teaching others about conservation, sharing not only the story of the bison's near loss, but the story of how humans, through reverence and responsibility, can help restore what was almost destroyed. Across the border in Canada, Elk Island National Park becomes one of the world's most successful bison conservation sites. The park manages both plains bison and wood bison, each with unique histories and ecological roles. Elk Island's careful breeding programs, disease management, and habitat protection help stabilize populations that would later contribute to reintroduction projects throughout Canada and even beyond. The park becomes a quiet but powerful example of how thoughtful stewardship can rebuild a species from small beginnings. Yet the most profound expansion of restoration during this era emerges from indigenous nations. For many tribes across the Great Plains, the bison's return is far more than a conservation success. It is the revival of a relationship long intertwined with identity, spirituality, and community. Tribal lands, often fragmented by borders and policies, begin to host conservation herds managed by native communities themselves. These herds become living symbols of renewal, carrying deep cultural meaning. The Intertribal Buffalo Council, formed in 1992, brings together dozens of tribal nations dedicated to restoring bison to tribal lands. Their work blends ecological science with traditional knowledge, honoring the cultural significance of the bison while ensuring healthy, sustainable herds. Many tribal herds grow steadily, providing food, supporting ceremonies, and reconnecting younger generations with ancestral teachings. These efforts not only help the species recover, but help communities heal from the historic fractures caused by the loss of the bison in the 19th century. As the herds spread and multiply, questions of land use become increasingly important. The Great Plains, once an open expanse, is now shaped by agriculture, urban development, and private ownership. Restoration efforts must work within these realities. Some take place on national park lands. Others unfold on tribal lands or private ranches. Many new herds live behind fences, their movements limited by modern boundaries. Conservationists understand that the bison cannot return to the exact conditions of the past. But they also understand that even in these new landscapes, the bison can play an essential ecological role. Throughout the later 20th century, scientists deepened their understanding of how bison contribute to biodiversity. They study how the animals create habitat mosaics, how their grazing patterns prevent grasslands from becoming overgrown, and how their movements influence everything from soil nutrients to nesting grounds for birds. With each discovery, the argument for restoration grows stronger. The bison is not only a symbol of resilience. It is an ecological engineer whose presence shapes entire communities of life. This recognition inspires new projects across the continent. Wildlife managers begin exploring opportunities to reintroduce bison to areas where they had been absent for generations. Some ranchers, moved by conservation ideals, convert parts of their lands into bison preserves. Environmental organizations partner with governments and tribes to create spaces where the animals can live semi-wild lives, roaming across landscapes large enough to restore a sense of natural rhythm. Yet restoration is never without challenges. Disease management remains a concern, especially in regions where cattle ranching is prominent. Land availability limits the size of potential herds. Questions about genetics, ecological impact, and long-term sustainability require careful thought. Each new restoration site involves collaboration, planning, and community engagement. Still, the momentum continues to grow. The bison, once nearly vanished, begins to appear in more and more places, not as relics or exhibits, but as living participants in the recovery of the land. Imagine now a gentle evening in Wind Cave National Park. The light softens across the hills. A herd moves slowly through the grass, their silhouettes framed by the fading glow. The calves lie nestled beside their mothers. The bulls graze quietly, their forms steady and grounded. The land feels alive, not only because the bison are present, but because their presence restores an ancient balance. So Part 13 rests here, in a moment when the bison's recovery expands across new and varied landscapes. Their return is no longer limited to small sanctuaries. It is guided by science, culture, tradition, and a deeper understanding of ecology. In the next part, we will explore how modern challenges shape the continued recovery of the species, and how the story of the bison enters the 21st century with renewed purpose. Below is Part 14, written gently in your calm, sleep-friendly background historian voice and targeted to approximately 1,000 words. Part 14. Modern Challenges and a Resilient Future. As we drift into part 14 of this soft and steady story, allow the quiet of the plains to settle within you once more. The bison now stand firmly within the modern era. Their numbers, though still far below their ancient millions, are stable. Their herds span refuges, parks, ranches, and tribal lands. Their near extinction has become a symbol of both loss and renewal. But as the world around them continues to evolve, new challenges arise. Tonight, we explore how the bison navigates the complexities of the 21st century, where recovery must unfold alongside the realities of a world shaped by people. Imagine the plains today, stretching beneath a wide and shifting sky. The wind still moves through the grasses with the same soft whisper heard centuries ago. But the land is no longer the boundless sweep it once was. Roads carve lines across prairies. Fences mark boundaries. Towns and farms extend into what were once migration routes. The bison now lives in landscapes that must be shared, negotiated, and carefully managed. Conservation has not ended. It has simply entered a new chapter. One of the most persistent challenges of modern bison recovery is habitat. The Great Plains, once among the largest grassland ecosystems on Earth, has been dramatically transformed. Agriculture claims much of the land. Urban development occupies more. Even in areas where grasslands remain, fences prevent wide-ranging movements. The bison, whose migrations once stretched across hundreds of miles, now inhabit smaller spaces. These enclosed landscapes require thoughtful management to ensure that herds remain healthy, genetically diverse, and able to express natural behaviors. In Yellowstone National Park, the largest wild herd in the United States still faces pressures unlike those of ancient times. The park itself offers rich habitat, but bison do not recognize its boundaries. When winter deepens and food grows scarce, the animals sometimes migrate beyond park limits into surrounding lands. Here, modern complications arise. Concerns about disease transmission, especially brucellosis, fuel tensions between wildlife managers and cattle ranchers. Bison that leave the park are often hazed back inside or confined to limit their contact with livestock. This delicate balance reflects a broader challenge in modern conservation: how to protect a wild species when its needs intersect with human industries and livelihoods. Disease management is not the only concern. Genetic diversity remains a significant issue. The bison that live today are descended from a very small number of survivors. While their recovery is remarkable, their limited genetic pool means that careful breeding and herd management are essential for long-term health. Scientists use modern genetic tools to assess herds, identify lineage bottlenecks, and determine how best to maintain the species' vitality. Some herds retain traces of cattle ancestry from early crossbreeding attempts. Conservationists debate how these animals fit into long-term restoration goals. These discussions require both scientific understanding and cultural sensitivity. Climate change introduces further complexity. Shifting weather patterns affect grassland ecosystems, altering the availability of water and forage. Droughts become more frequent in some regions, intense storms in others. As the climate shifts, so too does the delicate balance of prairie life. Bison, resilient by nature, adapt to a wide range of conditions, but the cumulative effects of climate change present new and unpredictable pressures. Conservation plans increasingly include climate models and habitat projections to help ensure that herds can thrive in future decades. Despite these challenges, the modern era also brings new opportunities for bison recovery. Many people across North America have developed a renewed appreciation for the species. Schools teach the story of the bison as an example of resilience and ecological importance. Visitors to national parks and refuges watch herds with admiration and reverence. The public's enthusiasm strengthens the political and financial support needed for continued conservation. One of the most hopeful developments of the 21st century is the active role of tribal nations in leading restoration efforts. For many indigenous peoples, the bison's return is deeply intertwined with cultural survival. Tribal herds provide food, support ceremonies, and reinforce connections to ancestors. These herds are often managed with both scientific rigor and traditional knowledge. Many tribes collaborate with conservation organizations, government agencies, and universities to develop new strategies that honor both ecological health and cultural significance. Through the Intertribal Buffalo Council and other partnerships, tens of thousands of bison now live on tribal lands across the United States. These herds are often managed in ways that prioritize community needs, ecological restoration, and long-term stewardship. Tribal-led conservation stands as one of the most inspiring and meaningful aspects of the species revival. It reflects not only a restoration of the bison, but a restoration of relationships, values, and histories long disrupted by colonization and loss. Alongside tribal efforts, large conservation organizations have begun acquiring land specifically for prairie restoration. The American Prairie Reserve in Montana, for example, aims to create one of the largest protected grassland ecosystems in the world. This project seeks to reconnect fragmented habitats, introduce conservation herds, and restore ecological processes that once defined the northern plains. While still evolving, it represents a bold attempt to imagine a future where bison once again move across wide, open spaces. Private ranchers and landowners also continue to play a role. Some raise bison for conservation. Others raise them as livestock in ways that preserve many natural behaviors. The presence of these herds helps maintain genetic diversity and keeps public interest in the species strong. Although ranching and conservation sometimes intersect in complex ways, they both contribute to the bison's presence on the landscape. Internationally, interest in bison conservation has grown as well. Countries in Europe, inspired by the American success story, have undertaken large-scale projects to restore their own bison species, the European bison. Though different from the American plains bison, the European animals share a similar history of near extinction and recovery. The global attention to bison restoration highlights the universal desire to reconnect with wild species and wild places. As we rest here at the end of Part 14, imagine a herd moving slowly across a modern prairie preserve. The setting sun casts long shadows behind them. Calves nuzzle their mothers. Bulls stand watchfully at the edges. The air is quiet except for the soft sounds of grazing. These animals, once so close to disappearing forever, now stand as living proof of what can happen when people choose protection over destruction, stewardship over neglect. The story of the bison is no longer one of loss alone. It is a story of continued effort, thoughtful management, and the shared hope that wildness, in some form, can endure. Part 15. A Symbol Return to the Heart. As we drift softly into Part 15 of this quiet journey, I invite you to let the plains open once more in your imagination. The grasses sway with an easy gentleness. The sky stretches endlessly above, holding a soft and fading light. The bison who move through this world are no longer the vast river of life they once were, yet they are no longer ghosts of a nearly vanished past. They exist now in a different way, a way shaped as much by memory and meaning as by the land itself. Tonight, we explore how the bison has become a symbol woven into the cultural identity of North America, cherished not only for its ecological role, but for the story it carries and the lessons it offers. Imagine meeting a bison today, perhaps at the edge of Yellowstone, or on a tribal range on the northern plains, or within a protected refuge at dusk. You feel something in their presence that touches a deeper place within you. It is not simply the size of the animal, nor the ancient curve of its horns, nor the thick fur that moves with the wind. It is something quieter. Something that feels like recognition. A reminder that this creature carries a long history, one that parallels the history of the land itself. For many tribal nations, this sense of recognition is not metaphorical. It is a lived reality. The return of the bison represents the renewal of traditions that go back countless generations. Songs, stories, dances, and ceremonies connected to the bison speak of relationships rooted in reciprocity and respect. To these communities, the bison is a relative, a teacher, a sustainer of life. When colonial pressures shattered the herds in the 19th century, the damage was not only ecological. It was cultural and spiritual as well. The near disappearance of the bison tore open wounds that lasted for generations. In the modern era, as tribal conservation programs flourish, the return of the bison allows those wounds to begin healing. Young people on reservations learn to care for herds. Elders teach stories that had once seemed like memories from a world that would never return. Ceremonial hunts, carried out with reverence and gratitude, reconnect families with values and practices older than any written record. For many tribes, bringing the bison home is an act of cultural sovereignty, of reclaiming what was taken and restoring what remains sacred. Beyond tribal communities, the bison has come to represent something meaningful for the United States and Canada as a whole. It symbolizes resilience. It embodies the idea that even when a species is pushed to the very edge, dedicated stewardship can help bring it back. The bison stands as the national mammal of the United States, a recognition that reflects the deep place it holds in the nation's story. It appears on coins, seals, and emblems. It is taught in classrooms, visited in parks, and celebrated in museums. Yet its symbolism is not only patriotic. It is also ecological, emotional, and ethical. For many people, the bison represents a connection to nature that modern life sometimes obscures. To stand quietly in the presence of a bison is to feel the echo of a time before highways and fences, before skyscrapers and screens. The animal speaks, without words, of endurance and adaptation. It invites reflection on how humans shape the natural world and how the natural world, in turn, shapes us. Writers, artists, and poets continue to be inspired by the bison story. Paintings capture the animal against sweeping horizons. Books explore the lessons hidden within its survival. Films and documentaries trace its long journey from abundance to near extinction and toward renewal. Through these creative works, the bison becomes more than an animal. It becomes a storyteller itself, carrying a narrative that audiences across generations can learn from. Modern conservationists also look to the bison as a symbol of what restoration can achieve. The species recovery is often cited as one of the earliest and most successful conservation stories in North America. It serves as a reminder that even after profound loss, hope is possible. That ecosystems can be revived. That species can return. And that human choices, whether destructive or protective, hold immense power. This symbolism extends beyond ecological and cultural spheres into the realm of identity. The bison represents strength, but not the rigid, conquering strength often depicted in legends of expansion. It represents a quieter, steadier strength. A strength rooted in endurance, adaptation, and a relationship with the land. It embodies the idea that resilience does not always mean dominating a landscape, but living in dynamic balance with it. Imagine now a quiet scene at twilight on a tribal range. A small herd grazes in a gentle arc along a hillside. The calves, sleepy from the warmth of the day, lie close to their mothers. A breeze carries the soft scent of sage and dust. In the distance stands a group of people, perhaps a family or community members, watching the herd with reverence. To them, this moment is not just about wildlife. It is about continuity. About the revival of a bond nearly broken but never forgotten. The bison's symbolic power also inspires collaboration across groups who may otherwise have little reason to work together. Tribal nations, conservation organizations, government agencies, ranchers, and scientists often come together because of their shared respect for the animal. In a world where interests frequently conflict, the bison becomes a unifying force. It invites dialogue, partnership, and long-term thinking. Yet despite all this meaning, the animal remains grounded in its own simple truth. The bison does not carry symbolism by choice. It does not seek reverence or representation. It simply lives, grazing where grass grows, moving with the seasons, raising its young with quiet instinct. And perhaps this is part of what makes its symbolism so powerful. The bison teaches not through words or arguments, but through presence. Through an enduring rhythm that stretches back millennia. Through the reminder that the natural world has its own wisdom, older and deeper than any human story. So part 15 rests here, in this gentle place where the bison becomes more than a species saved from extinction. It becomes a symbol returned to the heart of a continent. A bridge between past and future. A quiet reminder of what can be lost, and what can still be restored. Part 16. Science, Stewardship, and the Future of the Grasslands. As we settle into part 16 of this long and quiet journey, allow your thoughts to soften and drift once more across the open prairie. The wind moves gently through the grasses. The light fades slowly over distant hills. And the bison, steady and enduring, continue their quiet work shaping the land beneath them. Tonight, we explore how the modern story of the bison intertwines with science, land stewardship, and the long arc of the prairie's future. This chapter brings us into a time when knowledge and care blend together, helping guide a species once nearly lost into a world still learning how to protect it. Imagine a modern conservation scientist standing on a restored prairie, clipboard in hand, watching a herd of bison graze in the distance. The tools have changed from the early days of conservation. Where naturalists once relied on observation and instinct, today's researchers use satellite tracking, genetic analysis, and ecological modeling. Yet the purpose remains familiar. It is still about understanding the bison, protecting it, and learning from the quiet wisdom it brings to the land. One of the central themes of modern stewardship is the recognition that bison are not just animals living on the land. They are animals living with the land. Their behavior directly shapes the prairie ecosystem. Scientists study how bison grazing patterns promote plant diversity, how their movement prevents woody plants from taking over the grasslands, and how their wallow supports species that would struggle to survive elsewhere. Each discovery reinforces the idea that restoring bison is part of restoring the prairie itself. In many places, conservationists use the bison as a natural tool for land management. Instead of mowing grasslands or using machinery to maintain plant balance, they rely on the animal's historic patterns of grazing. Bison graze differently from cattle, moving in broad, shifting patterns rather than grazing a single patch intensively. This allows grasses to recover and encourages a rich tapestry of plant life. Birds, insects, and small mammals thrive in this renewed diversity. The return of bison often leads to a return of species that had quietly disappeared from the modern prairie. Fire, too, becomes an important part of this stewardship. Indigenous peoples have long used controlled burning to maintain healthy grasslands. Modern scientists have begun to integrate these traditional practices into contemporary land management. Bison respond instinctively to newly burned areas, grazing fresh shoots that sprout quickly after a fire. This cycle of burning and grazing creates a dynamic ecosystem that supports countless forms of life. In this way, ancient knowledge and modern science work side by side, honoring the rhythms that shaped the Great Plains long before settlement and industry transformed them. Genetics also plays an important role in the future of the bison. Because the species descended from such a small number of survivors, maintaining genetic diversity is essential. Scientists use DNA analysis to identify herds with the strongest genetic health. They work to prevent inbreeding and ensure that bison populations remain resilient against disease and environmental change. Some herds carry traces of cattle ancestry from early hybridization efforts. Researchers carefully study these lineages, exploring ways to preserve the species' identity while embracing the complexity of its history. Even with these advances, the question of how large a role the bison can play in the future remains open. The Great Plains are no longer a vast, uninterrupted expanse. Modern landscapes are shaped by property lines, cities, ranches, highways, and cultivated fields. Bison cannot roam as they once did. Instead, they inhabit a mosaic of protected lands, private ranches, and tribal reservations. The future requires creative thinking about how humans and bison can share space, balancing ecological needs with cultural, economic, and social considerations. One of the most meaningful parts of this shared future involves the leadership of tribal nations. Indigenous communities continue to guide restoration efforts with a perspective deeply rooted in ancestral knowledge. They understand the bison's role not only as an ecological force, but as a member of a larger living community. Tribal land managers blend traditional stewardship with modern science, creating conservation programs that honor both culture and ecology. These efforts include teaching young people the skills and values required to care for bison. Students learn about grazing patterns, herd health, genetics, and sustainable land use. They also learn stories passed down across generations, stories that remind them that caring for the bison is part of caring for themselves, their ancestors, and their future. This blending of education and tradition strengthens communities and ensures that bison restoration remains grounded in meaning, purpose, and connection. Conservation organizations and government agencies also partner in this work. Long-term plans for prairie restoration include creating wildlife corridors, expanding protected areas, and reconnecting fragmented habitats. While these goals are ambitious, they reflect a growing recognition that healthy grasslands depend on the presence of keystone species like the bison. Some modern projects focus on reintroducing bison to regions where they have been absent for more than a century. Each reintroduction is a moment of quiet celebration. When the animals step off transport trailers and onto the soil of their ancestral lands, their hooves leave prints that echo across both time and memory. These moments remind us that restoration is not simply a scientific endeavor. It is an act of healing for the land and for the people who steward it. Meanwhile, the global conversation about grassland conservation grows stronger. Ecologists now understand that grasslands are among the most threatened ecosystems on Earth. Restoring bison is part of a larger movement to protect prairies, savannas, and steppe environments around the world. Lessons learned from American bison conservation help guide similar efforts for other species in other regions, from European bison in Poland to Saiga antelope in Central Asia. Imagine, now, a quiet dawn on a restored prairie. The first light of morning brushes the tips of the grasses. The air is cool and gentle. A herd of bison moves slowly through the landscape, their breath visible in the early light. Each step they take wakes the land, stirring insects, shaking seeds loose from dry stalks, creating subtle changes that ripple outward in ways difficult to see but easy to feel. This is stewardship through presence, an ancient rhythm reawakened. So part 16 rests here, in the quiet recognition that the bison's future is shaped by both knowledge and care. Modern science deepens our understanding. Traditional stewardship grounds that understanding in wisdom. Together, they create a path forward, where the bison can continue to shape the land and remind us of our responsibilities to the natural world. Part 17. The Great Plains Reimagined. As we drift into Part 17 of this quiet and unfolding story, I invite you to picture the plains once more beneath a gentle sky. Evening light spills across grasses that shimmer like soft waves. A small herd of bison grazes in the distance, their shape steady and timeless. These animals, once nearly lost, now stand at the center of a growing movement to reimagine what the Great Plains might become in the future. Tonight, we explore how conservationists, communities, and tribes work together to restore not only bison herds, but the very spirit of the prairie itself. To understand this movement, imagine stepping into a meeting room in a modern conservation office. Maps stretch across the walls, showing fragments of prairie scattered among farmland, cities, and ranch lands. Biologists trace migration corridors. Land managers discuss soil health and water availability. Tribal leaders speak about cultural renewal. And at the heart of every discussion lies a shared question: how do we bring back the essence of a landscape once shaped by millions of bison? The Great Plains Restoration Movement does not seek to recreate the past exactly as it was. The world has changed too much. Towns and fences will not simply disappear. Highways and railways carve permanent paths across the land. Yet within this transformed landscape, a renewed vision is taking shape, one that blends memory with possibility. One of the most ambitious efforts emerges in Montana, where the American Prairie Initiative works to build one of the largest protected grassland ecosystems in North America. Unlike traditional parks, this project unfolds slowly, parcel by parcel, as land becomes available. Its goal is to create connected spaces where bison and other wildlife can roam more freely, shaping the land with ancient patterns of movement. Scientists partner with ranchers, tribal nations, and local communities to restore native grasses, protect watersheds, and expand habitat. Some people imagine a future where herds move across these lands as their ancestors once did, not in the millions, perhaps, but in numbers large enough to restore ecological processes that have long been dormant. Others see these lands as places where the public can reconnect with the rhythms of the prairie, where people can stand quietly and listen to the low grunts of bison or the soft call of prairie birds returning to restored nesting grounds. In South Dakota, similar visions take root at Wind Cave National Park, Badlands National Park, and tribal lands such as Pine Ridge and Rosebud. Each landscape offers a unique mosaic of hills, canyons, and rolling grass. Restoration projects here are shaped not only by ecological goals, but by cultural ones. For many Lakota communities, the restoration of bison is part of restoring an entire worldview grounded in respect, reciprocity, and relationship. Imagine young students on a school field trip to a tribal bison herd. They stand at a respectful distance, watching the animals graze. Their teachers speak softly about the ways bison shaped their ancestors' lives. Elders share stories of hunts carried out with gratitude, ceremonies honoring the animal, and lessons about taking only what is needed. These moments remind the students that their future is connected to the land, just as their ancestors' futures once were. In Canada, conservationists at Grasslands National Park and Elk Island National Park work to protect and expand herds that now serve as genetic reservoirs for global restoration efforts. These parks, vast and windswept, offer some of the best remaining examples of native prairie. Bison here roam among sagebrush valleys and mixed grasslands, their presence reviving ecological rhythms that have been absent for more than a century. But restoration is not limited to public lands. Private ranchers also contribute to this vision. Some raise bison commercially, yet in ways that preserve many natural behaviors. Others set aside parts of their land for conservation herds or ecological research. Their participation in restoration highlights a key truth: the future of the bison, and the prairie they help shape, depends on cooperation among many different kinds of land stewards. For the Great Plains restoration movement, collaboration is essential. Scientists study grassland dynamics, working to understand how bison grazing interacts with fire cycles, drought patterns, and soil regeneration. Tribal nations contribute traditional ecological knowledge that reveals relationships unseen in scientific data. Ranchers bring insight from generations of working the land. Conservation organizations provide resources, planning, and long-term vision. Together, these groups form a network of stewards, each carrying a part of the responsibility once held by the plains themselves. This collaboration extends beyond ecological concerns. Many restoration efforts emphasize community involvement, education, and stewardship. Programs teach children how to identify native grasses, how to track animal movements, and how to understand the interconnectedness of life on the prairie. Youth leadership programs encourage young people from prairie communities to take part in conservation work. These efforts help cultivate a generation who will inherit both the challenges and the possibilities of the Great Plains. Yet even with this optimism, the work is not simple. The prairie remains one of the most endangered ecosystems on Earth. Climate change threatens water sources and alters growing seasons. Economic pressures influence land use. Conservationists must navigate political and social tension surrounding land ownership, grazing rights, and wildlife management. But despite these complexities, the movement continues, grounded in a vision that honors both past and future. Imagine now a restored section of prairie at sunset. The air is warm and quiet. A herd of bison grazes nearby, their forms slowly darkening as the light fades. In the distance, pronghorn move across a ridge. A meadowlark sings its final notes for the day. The land feels alive in a way that suggests not only survival, but renewal. This is what restoration means. Not the perfect recreation of a vanished world, but the careful nurturing of a living one. As the 20th century gives way to the 21st, the story of the bison becomes entwined with broader questions about how humans relate to land. The bison's return invites us to imagine landscapes where wildness is not pushed aside, but welcomed back. To consider our role not only as users of the land, but as caretakers of it. To see the prairie not as empty space, but as a vibrant ecosystem filled with potential. So part 17 rests here, in a moment where imagination meets stewardship. The Great Plains, once nearly silenced by loss, are beginning to speak again through the presence of bison and the efforts of those who care for them. In the next part, we will explore how cultural narratives, art, and storytelling keep the memory and meaning of the bison alive, shaping how future generations understand and cherish this remarkable creature. Part 18. The Bison in Memory, Art, and Story. As we drift gently into part 18 of this long and restful journey, imagine yourself settling once more into the soft breath of the prairie. The grasses sway with a familiar rhythm. The horizon stretches endlessly, painted in quiet tones of gold and blue. And the bison, sturdy and calm, moves slowly across this landscape. Not only as a living being, but as a shape carried through memory, art, and story. Tonight, we explore how the bison lives on not just in the land, but in the human imagination, influencing how people understand history, identity, resilience, and connection. To begin, imagine a museum gallery filled with paintings of the Great Plains. Some show vast herds moving like shadows across the land. Others depict a single animal, standing quietly beneath a wide sky, its breath soft in the cold morning air. Painters like George Catlin and Frederick Remington became some of the first to capture the bison on canvas, recognizing even in their own time that the herds were disappearing. Their work served not only as artistic expression, but as documentation, preserving an image of a world that would soon be altered forever. These paintings shaped how generations of people imagined the West. The bison became a symbol of strength and wildness, a reminder of landscapes untouched by roads and industry. Children looking at these images saw an animal that seemed both ancient and enduring. Adults saw a creature carrying the weight of both beauty and tragedy. Through the lens of art, the bison took on a kind of mythic presence, something larger than life, even as the species itself dwindled. Literature also embraced the bison story. Writers described the herds as oceans of life, as thunder rolling across the earth, as symbols of both freedom and fragility. In indigenous storytelling, the bison appears not merely as an animal but as a guide, a protector, and a relative. Many oral traditions speak of the bison offering itself to sustain human life, teaching lessons of respect, gratitude, and balance. These stories hold a gentle wisdom, reminding listeners that survival is not a simple act of taking from the land, but of giving back to it. As the 20th century progressed and the bison's population slowly recovered, filmmakers and authors revisited the species' dramatic history. Documentaries traced the arc from abundance to near extinction and into renewal. Writers explored the emotional and cultural weight of that journey. For many readers and viewers, learning about the bison became a lesson in both ecological stewardship and humility. The story encouraged reflection on how humans shape the world and how the world, in turn, shapes human identity. The bison appears in children's books as well, drawn with soft edges and warm colors. These books introduce young readers to the idea that wild animals have stories worth knowing and protecting. They teach children that even the mightiest creatures can be vulnerable, and that restoration is possible when people work together. In this way, the bison becomes a gentle teacher for new generations, helping instill values of care and empathy. Beyond museums, books, and films, the bison lives on in places far less formal. It appears on coffee mugs, T-shirts, postcards, and roadside souvenirs throughout the plains. Tourists buy car decals shaped like the silhouette of a bison standing beneath a sunset. Native artists create beadwork and sculpture honoring the animal's cultural role. Ranchers mount bison skulls on barn walls, not as trophies, but as reminders of a heritage rooted in the land. the bison's image becomes part of daily life, woven into small, familiar moments. But some of the most powerful storytelling does not happen on canvas or in print. It happens in the quiet conversations between elders and youth, especially in indigenous communities where the bison remains central to cultural identity. These storytellers describe a time when the land moved with the rhythm of hooves, when ceremonies honored the life of the animal, and when the bison's disappearance brought grief deeper than words could express. They speak not only of hardship, but of hope, the hope that restoring the bison means restoring a part of themselves. Imagine a young person sitting beside a grandparent at dusk, listening to a story told in a soft, steady voice. The elder describes a hunt carried out with respect, or a dance performed in gratitude, or a moment when the people and the bison shared the same breath of the land. For that young listener, the bison becomes more than a creature in a photograph. It becomes part of a living heritage, something to protect, honor, and carry forward. In classrooms, teachers use the story of the bison to help students understand the complexities of history. They speak about ecology, economics, colonization, and conservation. Students learn that the bison story is not just about animals, but about people, about relationships disrupted and relationships restored. In learning this, many students feel a renewed sense of responsibility, not only toward wildlife, but toward the world they will inherit. Artists of the modern era continue to create new interpretations of the bison, blending tradition with contemporary forms. Some sculpt the bison in steel or clay, capturing its strength in bold lines. Others use photography to reveal the quiet grace of small herds moving through restored prairies. Musicians write songs that echo the plains, using melody to express something wordless about the animal's endurance. Even digital artists contribute, painting luminous bison beneath starlit skies, reminding viewers that imagination is also a tool for conservation. The bison story has also become part of environmental philosophy. Scholars and activists speak of the species as an example of how ecosystems can be damaged and how they can heal. They remind us that conservation is not simply about saving animals, but about saving relationships between species, between people, and between the land and the sky that shelters it. As you imagine this world, picture a quiet evening on a prairie overlook. A visitor stands watching a small herd in the distance. They may not know every detail of the bison's history, yet something in the moment fills them with a sense of reverence. Perhaps it is the silhouette of the animals against the twilight. Perhaps it is the slow, peaceful way they move. Perhaps it is the knowledge that these creatures survived something almost unimaginable, and that their presence now is a testament to both wild resilience and human care. The bison story is no longer held only in the land. It is held in art, in memory, in community. It is carried forward by storytellers, educators, conservationists, and the animals themselves. It is a story shared across generations and across boundaries. So part 18 rests here, in the quiet understanding that the bison lives as much in our imagination as on the prairie. Its story is one we tell to understand who we were, who we are, and who we hope to become. Part 19. Lessons in Resilience and Responsibility. As we arrive gently at part 19 of this long and quiet journey, I invite you once more to settle into the soft rhythm of the plains. The grasses breathe with the wind. The horizon glows faintly with the last traces of daylight. And the bison, calm and enduring, stands as a quiet teacher at the center of it all. Tonight, we reflect on the lessons this remarkable animal offers us. Lessons about resilience. Lessons about responsibility. And lessons about the bond between people and the land they share. Imagine standing on a prairie overlook at dawn. The air is cool, the world still waking. A herd of bison moves slowly through the blue morning light. They graze without hurry, their movement steady and grounded. In their presence, you sense something ancient. Something that has survived not because it was untouched by hardship, but because it learned to endure, to adapt, and to continue. The story of the bison's near extinction is painful to revisit. It carries sorrow, loss, and a reminder of how fragile life can become when human ambition grows unchecked. Yet the story of the bison's recovery, slow and patient, reveals something equally profound. It shows that destruction is not the only path humans are capable of shaping. We can choose stewardship instead of exploitation, care instead of neglect, restoration instead of ruin. From this long journey, the bison offers its first lesson: resilience is born not from strength alone, but from the ability to persist with quiet determination. The bison survived ice ages, storms, predators, disease, and the collapse of nearly its entire species. Its survival teaches us that endurance is not loud. It is not forceful. It lives in the steady rhythm of those who keep going even when the world shifts beneath them. The second lesson the bison offers is one of interconnectedness. The species did not decline alone, and it did not recover alone. Its disappearance reshaped the land. Its return began to heal it. Ecologists learned that every hoofprint, every grazing pattern, every wallow touches countless lives beyond the bison itself. Grasses, insects, birds, predators, and even soil microbes responded to the animal's presence. Through this, we learn that every choice we make touches something else. That no part of the natural world exists in isolation. That stewardship means understanding the relationships that bind species and landscapes together. A third lesson emerges from the human side of the story. When the bison collapsed in the late 19th century, the world stood on the brink of losing an ancient partner. Yet individuals and communities stepped forward. Their actions were not grand at first. They were small. A rancher protecting a handful of animals. A park ranger guarding a struggling herd. Tribal leaders maintaining cultural stories even when the animal itself had become scarce. These small acts formed threads that wove together into a broader movement. From them, we learn the power of modest actions, repeated with care, to create change far greater than they might seem capable of. A fourth lesson speaks to responsibility across generations. The people who began restoring the bison did so knowing they would never see the species return to anything like its ancient numbers. Yet they worked anyway. Their efforts were for the future, for children and grandchildren they would never meet. This teaches us that stewardship is not about instant results. It is about planting seeds whose blossoms will be witnessed by others. Caring for the land is a gift extended forward in time. A fifth lesson arises from the cultural resilience of indigenous peoples. For many tribes, the destruction of the bison was not only ecological, but spiritual. Its return, therefore, is not only scientific, but deeply cultural. It reflects centuries of survival, adaptation, and resistance. From this, we learn the power of memory and the strength of cultural continuity, even in the face of profound loss. We learn that restoring the natural world can also restore parts of ourselves. As modern conservation efforts continue, the bison invites us to reflect on our role in shaping the future. It reminds us that humans are not separate from nature. We are part of it. Our decisions ripple through ecosystems. Our stewardship affects species we may never see. Our choices today shape landscapes tomorrow. To walk gently on the earth is not only an ecological responsibility. It is an ethical one. Imagine now a quiet evening on tribal land, a ceremonial fire glowing softly as elders speak about the return of the bison. Their stories hold gratitude for those who protected the animal and guidance for future generations who will continue to care for it. These gatherings remind us that conservation is not simply an environmental discipline. It is a relationship, a promise between people and the land. Across refuges and parks, visitors stand quietly as bison move across ridges and valleys. Some watch with scientific curiosity, others with cultural reverence, still others with simple admiration. In all these reactions, the bison teaches a final lesson: to be present, to witness the world with patience, to appreciate the quiet beauty of life even when it unfolds slowly, to understand that recovery, like migration, happens step by step. The bison is not just an animal that survived. It is an emblem of what becomes possible when humanity pauses, reflects, and chooses a different path. It stands as a reminder of the mistakes that nearly destroyed it, and of the care that helped it return. It shows that even when loss seems irreversible, healing can begin with a single act. A fence lowered, a land set aside, a story remembered, a calf born in spring. So part 19 rests here, in a place of gentle reflection. The bison's lessons echo softly across the plains, carried by the wind, waiting for those who walk the land to hear them. The story has not ended. It continues, shaped by choices made every day. Part 20. An enduring presence on the quiet plains. As we come gently into part 20, the final chapter of this long and calming journey, allow your breath to settle into an easy, steady rhythm. The plains stretch once more across your imagination, quiet and open beneath a deepening sky. A soft wind moves through the grasses, carrying with it the echoes of the story we have shared. A story that spans centuries. A story of loss and renewal. And at its center stands the bison, calm and enduring, still shaping the land even after so much has changed. Tonight, we bring this narrative to a restful close, not as an ending, but as a soft continuation. For the bison story is not finished. It is still unfolding, step by quiet step, across the prairies, across cultural memory, and across the living heart of the land. Imagine, now, the plains at dusk. The light fades into the soft purples and blues of evening. A small herd of bison moves slowly through the tall grasses, their silhouettes dark and steady. The calves stay close to their mothers. The older bulls graze with deliberate calm. The rhythm of their movement is ancient, even though the conditions around them are new. As the sunlight slips away, the land seems to exhale, holding within it the long memory of all that has passed. In this gentle moment, it is almost impossible to imagine the near extinction that shadowed these animals little more than a century ago. Yet that memory remains important. The bison teaches us that forgetting the past can lead us toward repeating its mistakes. Remembering, however softly, allows us to walk with intention, knowing how delicate the balance is between destruction and renewal. The final lesson the bison offers is one of presence. After all the hardship, all the loss, and all the careful restoration, the bison still moves with quiet dignity. It does not hurry. It does not seek attention. It simply exists, filling its place in the world with a calm that reminds us of the natural rhythms we once knew and sometimes forget. As we reflect on the bison's enduring presence, we also reflect on the landscape it inhabits. the Great Plains remain one of the world's most subtle yet profound ecosystems. From a distance, the prairie appears simple, even empty. But once you walk within it, you feel the depth of its life. Its grasses hold centuries of stories. Its soil carries the imprint of ancient hooves. Its sky expands the spirit in ways few landscapes can. The bison, by returning to these spaces, restores more than an ecological function. It restores a feeling, a memory of wildness that still belongs to the continent. The legacy of the bison's near loss has shaped conservation across the world. It taught us that even the largest, strongest creatures are vulnerable when their world shifts too quickly. It taught us that people, too, must adapt, stepping away from exploitation and toward stewardship. Today, countless species benefit from the lessons learned during the bison's decline and recovery. The idea that a species can be brought back from the brink is now part of global conservation philosophy. Yet the bison's legacy goes beyond ecology. It resides in cultural memory. For tribes across North America, the return of the bison is a restoration of identity, a renewal of ceremony, a reconnection with teachings that hold deep meaning. The bison's survival is intertwined with cultural survival, and its presence on tribal lands brings healing that ripples across generations. For many others, the bison has become a symbol of the American and Canadian landscapes themselves. It represents the endurance of beauty despite hardship. It reminds people that the land holds wisdom far older than industrial time. It teaches patience, humility, and a sense of connection to the earth that modern life sometimes rushes past. Imagine now sitting beside a quiet stretch of prairie as night begins to fall. You hear the soft rustle of grass. Perhaps the distant grunt of a bison settling into its nightly rhythm. The sky above fills slowly with stars, each one shimmering with a quiet certainty that has outlived empires, migrations, and entire eras of human history. In this twilight, the bison becomes part of that timeless scene, a living thread connecting past and future. This is the enduring presence of the bison. Not a return to the vast herds of old, for history rarely moves backward, but a steady, grounded existence that acknowledges the past while shaping a different future. A future where wildness still has a heartbeat. Where hope grows in quiet places. Where the relationship between people and land continues to heal. And so, as we conclude this final part, let us rest in the understanding that the bison stands today not merely as a survivor, but as a guide. A reminder of what resilience looks like. A reminder of what responsibility asks of us. A reminder that even when a story seems nearly over, life can find a way to continue. Imagine the herd settling into the tall grass now, the calves dozing, the adult standing watch beneath a sky deep with stars. The plains breathe slowly. The land holds its calm. And the bison, steady and enduring, remains. This is where we leave them tonight. Not at an ending, but in a moment of peace. A moment of quiet presence beneath the wide and timeless sky. OUTRO. As we come to the end of our journey tonight, I invite you to rest for a moment in the quiet stillness of the plains. Let the gentle sweep of grass linger in your thoughts. Let the slow, steady rhythm of the bison story settle warmly into your mind. This has been a long path we've walked together, tracing centuries of history, loss, resilience, and renewal. And now, as the final light fades beyond the distant hills, we close our eyes to the calm presence of a species that has endured more than most. The bison's journey reminds us that even the deepest wounds in the natural world can be tended with patience. That even when hope grows thin, care can bring life back to the land. Their story is a quiet invitation to see ourselves as part of something larger, something older, something profoundly connected to the earth beneath us. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope you feel a sense of peace in knowing that the plains, though changed, still hold ancient rhythms. That somewhere under a wide and star-lit sky, a herd of bison moves slowly through the grass, shaping the land with every gentle step. Their breath, their presence, their quiet endurance echo against the night. Thank you for spending this time here with me, letting the story unfold softly in your thoughts. May the calm of the Great Plains stay with you as you drift into rest. And may the memory of the bison remind you that renewal is always possible, even in the quietest corners of the world. Good night from Background Historian. Sleep well, and I'll see you again soon for another journey through the gentle stories of our past.